Morning, everyone, and welcome to Nirvana's sixth day of memory. I just want to start by saying a huge thank you to each and every one of you that are here today. We've had an incredible 700 people sign up to today, making it Nirvana's biggest day of memory on record. And I'm incredibly humbled by the sheer number of people that are here today, because it shows us that actually people are concerned about this subject matter, people want to learn about it, and people want to make a difference. So huge thank yous for being here today. So a little bit about me. I'm Natasha Rattu. I'm the director of Nirvana. I've worked in the domestic abuse sector for over 15 years, and by trade, I'm a family and criminal barrister, so bring lots of professional experience into Nirvana. Nirvana was set up over 27 years ago by Jasvinder Sanghera, who escaped a forced marriage at the age of 16. Now, when I was reflecting upon what I would share with you today, because there was just so much that I could share with you, but not enough time, I've decided to share something quite personal that I don't always share. I'm quite conscious that we have many survivors watching this webinar today, many survivors that have made brave decisions and they're living estranged and living with discernment with their children. I'm also very aware that we'll have lots of people potentially watching this that are living with honor-based abuse right now and are contemplating leaving. So what I want to share with you is that Jasvinder Sanghera, the founder of Nirvana, is my mother. And I suppose the takeaway from that is that when we make brave decisions to leave, what we're doing effectively is breaking the legacy of abuse for the next generation. And I'm really determined to make that difference and demonstrate that the next generation is fighting this really important cause to make the changes that we need to see. We work by and for survivors. What we want to do at Nirvana is give the reality of these issues on the ground some reach. So I'm so humbled that you all here listening to us today. Now, Nirvana was set up by my mother as a result of two defining experiences in her life that I'm going to share with you. Now, the first of those experiences was when she was 16 years old, and she refused a marriage that my grandmother had planned for her. And I say grandmother because very often I think people think about abuse and they think about men always being a perpetrator, but actually in cases of honor-based abuse, perpetrators are multiple and complex. They can be mothers, fathers, brothers, sisters, uncles, and aunts. So my mum was 16 years old when she came home from school and was presented with a photograph of a man that she was told that she would have to marry. Now, to give some context to this, my mother had witnessed all of her older sisters marry men that they hadn't met before. And my mother was the only one to say no, because she quite clearly in her mind wanted to have an education. She wanted to go to school. She wanted to go to college and have a career, but that wasn't the future that was mapped out for her. And the consequence to her saying no was that she had no other option bar to run away from home. There wasn't any support or protection to her. And she ran away from Derby to Newcastle because I suppose at 16 that felt like a million miles away. So she left without any money, without any clothes, without anywhere to go, and for 2 weeks was living homeless in that way. And it was in that sheer moment of desperation, 2 weeks living homeless, that she decided that she would go to the police to get help, because who do you go to when you're very desperate? Police are often the last resort, and that's absolutely true for victims of honor-based abuse, because there is so much shame in speaking out that it's difficult to talk to practitioners, particularly statutory practitioners. So she's 16 years old. She goes to a police station in Newcastle, goes to the front desk and is met by a police officer, a male. And she explains that she has fled home, that her mother is forcing her to marry, and that she's got nowhere to go. Thankfully for her, in that moment, that officer didn't treat her like a stroppy teenage girl that had fallen out with her mum and that needed to go back home. He actually believed and validated her, and that was incredible. And I say incredible because many victims of honor-based abuse don't own the abuse and that they're a victim. They actually believe they're the perpetrator by speaking out because of all of the stigma that is associated to speaking out and the shame. So that was an incredibly bold move to speak to somebody that you didn't know, who might not understand what you're going through, and as a child might send you back home. Now, that police officer, thankfully for her, didn't treat her like that stroppy teenage girl and said, look, I believe you, and I'm not going to send you home on the condition that you ring home and you let your parents know that you're safe and well. Now, in that moment, that was an absolute lifeline. Now, we wouldn't be advocating that today because we're very aware of the risks associated to mediation, but that was a lifeline at that point. What I want to do is to read you an extract from my mum's book, Shame, about that conversation that she had with my grandmother. And I want you to humour me. I want you to imagine that you're a 16-year-old girl who, on one hand, loves her family incredibly, misses them, but on the other hand, wants to have the freedom to make choices in her own life. What would you want your mother to say to you? This is what my grandmother said to her. She said, thanks to you, I can't walk the streets of Derby anymore. I can't go to the Godora because people are talking, people spit at me. There was a pause and I thought she'd finished, but she was just catching her breath. You'll get what you deserve for ruining your family, you'll see. In a few months' time, you'll be rolling around in the gutter, which is no more than you deserve. You will amount to nothing. Nothing, do you hear me? And I hope that you give birth to a daughter who does to you what you have done to me. Then you will know what it feels like to raise a prostitute. I was so shocked by the viciousness of her attack that I was shaking. I couldn't believe it was turning out like this. I wanted her to stop. I wanted more than anything for the conversation to take a turn for the better, for her to say something, anything that showed me that she loved me or even that she cared a little. I wanted her to know that I loved her and my voice was thick with tears. I'll come back, Mum. I want to come back, but I won't marry that man. I'm only just 16. I want to live my own life. I want to go to college. I was talking as quickly as I could, trying to get my explanation out, but she started shouting over me and her voice was full of scorn. Well, live your own life then and good luck to you. In our eyes, you're dead. And with that, she slammed the phone down. You've shamed us. You are dead in our eyes. You've shamed us. You are dead in our eyes. Had I really done something so terrible that my parents could disown me? And had they really stopped loving me? Was it such a crime to want my own life? Now, that was the response that she got as a 16-year-old child. And as somebody who will be 55 this year, she won't appreciate me telling you that, but these are big decisions that you make for a lifetime. You make them knowing that potentially you may never have a connection with your family, with your community, with your identity. So when we're expecting victims that we're dealing with, survivors of honour-based abuse, to make these incredible decisions to leave, we've got to be mindful that there are more factors to pull you in than to pull you out. And we've got to be, as practitioners, the ones that help to pull them out and to make them safe. So I explained that there were two defining moments in my mother's life. So that was the first one. Now, the second one was that of my auntie Rabina. Now, my auntie Rabina was a year and a half older than my mother. She had done the honourable thing. She had, done the dutiful thing. She had married who the parents had expected her to marry. And very often, in our experience at Karma Nirvana, and my mum was no exception, when you flee, you tend to have secret contact with somebody, to have some connection with this former life that you miss and that you yearn for. So my mum had secret contact with my auntie Rabina. My mum came to learn that in this marriage that my auntie Rabina was in, that she experienced horrific domestic abuse. And she would plead with my grandparents to enable her to leave, for them to accept her back, but they would always push her back into that marriage to make it work, to be a better wife. It must be something that you've done. She was always made to be feeling that it was really her fault. So she was never embraced to come out of that domestic abuse. She was always pushed back in. And she would talk to my mum about the domestic abuse that she experienced, and my mum would quite gladly say, look, come and live with me. I can support you. I can give you a roof over your head. She had a son. I can help look after him. And my auntie would say, well, it's easy for you to say that because you don't have to think about mum, dad, the community, what people are going to say. And actually, now that you've left, all of the shame that's brought it's actually more difficult for me to leave. So that was the dilemma that she was in. So I'm going to read to you now a second extract from the book. To put this into context, after my mum had moved to Newcastle, she moved to Bradford and she was working on the markets. So this scene takes place at the Bradford markets. On the Sunday, after I'd spoken to Rabina about her husband, we were at Cannon Mills just outside Bradford when Lizzie ran up to our stall. Her hair was everywhere, her face was flushed. She was so breathless that it was a minute or two before she could speak. "Your mum's rang," she gasped. "It's your sister, Rabina." She didn't have to finish the sentence. Everything about her spoke of something terrible, and I headed straight for the phone box. My hand was shaking as I dialed, and my mum picked up almost at once. "What's happened?" She said, "It's Rabina. She's died. She's dead." My brain refused to process this. No, Rabina was my living, breathing, vibrant elder sister. She was part of me. We'd shared a bed. We'd walked to school together. She bought clothes for my wedding. I'd seen her just a week ago. What do you mean dead, Mum? How has she died? The words came out mechanically. I was an autopilot. There was a pause and I thought I heard a sob. "She's committed suicide. She set herself on fire and she died in hospital." The world seemed to stop. My legs went weak and I felt completely hollow. Numb with shock, I stood there listening to this really weird subhuman noise, and I realised it was howling and it was coming out of me. I steadied myself against the wall and I said, "Mum, I'm coming to Derby right now." "No," she said loudly, "don't come here, don't come to Derby, don't show your face. You would just make things worse." "Mum, Rabina is dead. Are you not going to let me come to the house?" "No, I'm telling you, you will make things worse." You would think that on losing a daughter in such a tragic and horrific way, that you would embrace this living, breathing daughter that you have. But that is the power of honour, and that is the power of shame, that actually even in that experience, it wasn't enough. And my mum, being the woman that she is, she did go to the funeral, and for every room that she walked into, the family walked out of. So she wasn't even able to embrace her sister's death in the way that you would expect a family to embrace the loved one, the commonality they have, that they're grieving for this person. It's interesting that it's a university statistic that South Asian women are 2 to 3 times more likely to commit suicide or self-harm than their white counterpart. And the research into this evidences that shame is very much a factor, that honour is very much a factor. So I think what this tells us is that actually we've got a lot of work to do. So coming to the Day of Memory then, and actually coming to Karma Nirvana. So it was that experience that set up Karma Nirvana, because my mother didn't want any other woman, and we were a women-only project back then, she didn't want any other woman to feel that her only way out of these situations is via suicide or death or disownment and being completely estranged from your family. Those are the only 2 options. So Karma Nirvana exists to provide another option where people are empowered to live life on their own terms. So that's where Karma Nirvana is. We have a 12-year-old helpline, 12 years this year. Last year, our helpline dealt with over 12,000 contacts from the UK alone. And I'm telling you that that isn't even the tip of the iceberg, because we know honour-based abuse is very hidden, it's undetectable. There are many more victims out there that aren't coming forward because of the stigma that exists that makes it difficult for them to do so. So that's a bit about Karma Nirvana and why we exist. So the Day of Memory. The Day of Memory, 7 years ago, Karma Nirvana teamed up with Cosmopolitan magazine in a joint petition to the government to ask for a national day to remember victims that have been killed to honour-based abuse. Those people that we have lost, that very often are not remembered because the people that have been complicit, I suppose, in their murder are their family members, and these are the people that you would expect to remember them, so they're not very often remembered. So this is why we mark this day in the calendar every year on the 14th of July, because the 14th of July is the birthday of Shafilia Ahmed, and we've got the privilege later on today to be hearing from school friend Melissa Harrigan to Shafilia Ahmed, talking about Shafilia and honouring her memory, and Geraint Jones, the senior investigating officer when Shafilia went missing. So we've got that real privilege today on the Day of Memory to remember Shafilia and to remember Banaz. So going on to the agenda then for today. So very shortly, we're going to be hearing a video from the Victim Commissioner, Dame Vera Baird, talking about why the Day of Memory is important to her. We then will be hearing from Nazir Afzal, talking about the Day of Memory and talking about why he feels passionate in advocating for victims of honour-based abuse. This then takes us to the middle section of our Day of Memory, where we'll be honouring Banaz, and we've got the privilege to hear from Paisey Mahmoud, the sister of Banaz Mahmoud, and the real privilege of hearing from Caroline Good, the senior investigating officer into Banaz's disappearance. We will then be moving into listening to Melissa and Grant. That part takes us into our comms toolkit, which we'll be launching with you this afternoon, and then the Q&A session. Now, you will see in the box directly below where I'm speaking that there is a box for you to type your questions. Now, throughout the day, we ask that you put your questions in that you have for any panel member that is speaking today. Our team at Karma Nirvana will be moderating those questions and pinning those for us to answer later on. If you have a direct question for anybody that's spoken, please can you just put their name on the message so we can direct it specifically to them. We will then, following on from that, have the final word from our founder, who will be telling you a lot about Karma Nirvana, Day of Memory, and summarising for the day. So that is our general agenda for the whole of today. So we're now going to go into the poll. So very shortly, a poll is going to come up on your screen, and you're going to need to interact. It's for us to find out who is attending today's Day of Memory. So the poll should be up. We'll give that 10 seconds, and then we will be going into some of the answers. So you should have around 10 seconds. So the poll is looking to identify who that we have attending the Day of Memory. We have survivors that are here. We have practitioners that are safeguarding in the statutory sector that are here, the third sector that are here, and the public. So we're just waiting for those poll results. So we should get those poll results in any moment. Okay. So I think we're having a bit of a technical issue with the poll. So we'll just wait to get those results a little bit later on. So we're now going to go into our first video. So our first video is from the Victim Commissioner, Dame Vera Baird. Dame Vera Baird is a huge advocate for victims of honour-based abuse. We have the real privilege of hearing her video. Sadly, she wasn't able to join us here today, but has produced this video to tell us about why the Day of Memory is so important to her. Before we go into that, however, I've just had the poll results come back to me. So in terms of who we have here, 45% of our audience are from the statutory sector and are professionals. We've got 35% that are from the third sector. We've got 15% that are from the public and 3% that are survivors. So thank you all so much for filling in those answers for the poll. We're now going to go into our video from Dame Vera Baird QC.
Hello. I would much have preferred to be in a group at this Memorial Day event with you, because I can recall from 2016 when I hosted as Police and Crime Commissioner the second Karma Nirvana Memorial Day for victims of honour-based abuse and forced marriage, how compelling the experience was, not only for me as Police and Crime Commissioner with a great deal of responsibility for the police going forward from that, but also the police themselves and all the other attendees from the local authorities and from charities keen to learn and to be able to lend a hand to help to stamp out this abysmal crime which affects so many people and had so little attention. That it was a very powerful, emotional and impactful day, and we went forward determined to do more. Since it became a crime to force a person to marry, the complaints of honour-based violence generally have increased by 50%. That is excellent. However, prosecutions have collapsed. From immediately after the legislation, they have dropped by 60% to today. This means that the matter is not being dealt with in the way that it needs to be, and we have to make a determined effect in the year to come to ensure that the criminal justice agencies really start to take it seriously. A very telling point is that in 2015, Her Majesty's Inspector of Constabulary, i.e. the police inspectors, did a national report about how honour-based violence was being dealt with and honour-based abuse, and did not find a good answer. They made sundry recommendations, almost all of which have not been universally implemented. This year, I think, is time to call for another report from HMIC, and although at the moment they can't go out and actually do what they would call boots on the ground reports, they do need to start laying the foundations, requiring the documentation and understanding the data, which it has to change. They must now drive the police service to do more and to do it well. And it's imperative too that the Crown Prosecution Service develops better expertise to take forward more cases. I'm afraid that it is a powerful message if someone is convicted of an offence. It sends through, whatever the cultural overlays are, into every community the truth, which is that this behaviour is unacceptable and will be dealt with severely by the criminal justice system. If that is not done, then that point is not fully made. So we have a good deal of work to do. I know Carmen and Ivana have a lot of respect for the way the Home Office have taken this matter on, but the criminal justice agencies just don't seem to be coming up for it. So I am in my first year as a Victims Commissioner, having been Police and Crime Commissioner in Northumbria until last June, but this is going to be a priority for me. Clearly Black Lives Matter as a campaign has brought this even more strongly to my attention, and it is going to be a significant priority. I think we need to get behind HMIC. We need to talk to the College of Policing about the calibre of training for the police force. We need to talk to the CPS about how much they have understanding and how little training they have had about this, and to shape things more fully. Importantly, all of these criminal justice agencies need to understand that the experts are organisations like Carmen Ivana and the community from which these wrongs develop, and that they should not go on without significant training and awareness raising input from those organisations. And we need to raise awareness with the public as well about these crimes, which are, I think, not widely understood or appreciated. And once you've been to an event like a Carmen Ivana Memorial Day, you really do understand how iniquitous, how appalling the impact of these crimes are, and you are really galvanised then to go forward. So I am sorry that we can't be talking to one another and sharing the emotional impact of being together about this issue, but nonetheless, please regard me as someone who's determined to work with this sector to ensure that we make significant progress in prosecutions, convictions, and contributing in all ways that we can to stamping out honour-based abuse. Enjoy the rest of the day and stay safe. Hello.
It was so inspirational. Really moved that Vera provided that video for us to share with you today. Dame Vera Baird, QC, is a huge advocate for victims of honour-based abuse, and I have so much respect and admiration for all that she's done. Earlier this year, I visited Vera's office to talk about the work of Carmen Ivana and honour-based abuse. And Vera supported writing a letter to the Home Office, as you heard in the video, around getting another inspection of police, because a 2015 inspection of police identified that only 3 out of 43 police forces are prepared to respond to honour-based abuse, which is just overwhelming when you think about it, that only 3 forces out of 43 are prepared. And actually the recommendations that came out of that inspection are not entirely complete. So there is so much work to be done, and we thank Vera for all that she's done to this agenda so far. So I'm now delighted to invite our next speaker, Our next speaker is really part and parcel of these days of memory that we have every year. He's a feature, he's a leader on the agenda of honour-based abuse. It's a real privilege that we have him here today to speak. So I'm not going to say much more than that, than to introduce our next speaker, Nazir Afzal.
Good morning, Natasha. Good morning to everybody. It's a delight to join you, even if it is for the next just 5 more minutes. Can I say, firstly, this is a really important day for all of us, and I'm glad that you've given up some of your time in order for us to take stock as to where we are, but also this is all about remembering those people whose families wanted to extinguish them from history. And unless we usurp that role, we become their families, these people would be forgotten. And that's why it's really really important that we have this day. I remember 7 years ago when Jazz and Carmen Nirvana pushed this campaign, and I joined their campaign. I remember my support for it appeared in Cosmopolitan. I could never show that page to my family because it also had 50 ways to please your lover, and it wasn't appropriate for them to see that bit, but it was really important for me to play my part. I probably I have prosecuted probably more honor killings, so-called honor killings, than anybody, not just in this country, but probably in the world, according to the US State Department. And that's nothing to be proud of. That's people whose lives were extinguished and whose potential was taken away without them having the opportunity to do what I know they could have done and what they could have achieved. And what I was able to do, and Caroline and Geraint and others you'll be hearing from today, was deliver justice, a small bit of justice, but at the same time recognizing that would never get them back, never bring them back, never put right the wrongs that were created in their names. And I remember back in the day we had the very first, at that time it was I thought the first national conference on forced marriage in 2004. I subsequently learned it was the world's first conference on forced marriage, which goes to show, and that's where I met Jasvinder Sanghera for the first time, it goes to show that literally is the journey we've been on over 16 years. And we learned how many people were being killed, invariably women, but there are male victims. We learned that this was all about power and control. This was about families who just did not want women in particular to be able to carry on and make the choices that others we take for granted. And those choices led to life and death decisions, in their cases, entirely death. And so, whether I can name them all, whether it's Sajda or Samira or Alicia or Shafilia or Banaz. I name Gita. I know them all. I remember them. They're etched on my brain, and the blood that poured from their bodies is something that I will never, I'll take to my grave, literally take to my grave. And therefore it's important that we learn from what we've done in the past. And we've made massive progress. Even the Americans, and for the Americans to think that we're good at anything is something, but even the Americans think that we lead the world in the way we deal with forced marriage, honor-based violence. But that's complacency on our part, because and you've already heard from Natasha, that's 12,000, 15,000 victims a year. The calls that the national network, national call gets, and other NGOs deal with, we're still dealing with literally the tip of the iceberg. And there are people who are in danger right now because we aren't doing our job to protect them. And you'll hear a lot about the first chance rule today, how you and all of us have one opportunity very often to be able to protect somebody, and we fail that. And you look at the litany of cases that I've dealt with and I've heard and you will hear about, and there were opportunities to protect, to save lives that weren't taken by authorities, by organizations, and by people. And we carry that burden because we didn't do enough for those people. I've written my book, my book, The Prosecutor's Out There, chapters 5 and 6. So 2 of my chapters are all about this issue of honor-based violence and forced marriage, because I wanted to remember the journey we'd been on, journey I'd personally been on, to recognize every single person whose life could have been protected and whose life wasn't. And it shames me that we couldn't do that. It shames me that we still don't do that, despite all the guidance and guidelines and toolkits, etc., etc. I want to pay tribute to Natasha, to Jasvinder, and to Carmen and Anup and Carmen Nirvana. I'm delighted and privileged to be one of your patrons. I know the phenomenal work that you do and continue to do, and you work with NGOs around the country. We're in very difficult times. Personally, I've had it from the far right. I've had it from Islamist groups. This morning, I had a brick through my window, and I'm still dealing with the consequences of that. There's a personal cost to leadership. Jasvinder will tell you that. Natasha will tell you that. If you put your head above the parapet and say that we're going to challenge this type of behavior, you will expect people to come for you. And that's why it's so important that we network. It's so important that we share. It's so important that we protect each other and look out for each other. And it's really important, even in this lockdown, even in COVID, we've seen an increase in honor-based violence and reporting. And we know that when we come out of this, more people will feel able to report what's happened. Are we ready to deal with that? I hope that we are. The point I make and I constantly make is that I go back 25 years. And my journey started when I met a woman at a conference, and she had her wedding ring, not on that finger, but on the opposite finger of her hand. And I said to her, why do you wear your wedding ring on the wrong finger? And she said, it's because they forced me to marry the wrong man. I looked at a woman who has a life of hopelessness, of despair, a life where she was not able to reach her potential, make all her choices, a life that could have been extinguished. But that was her protest. That was her protest because she didn't have a voice. And I made it my responsibility, as it is all of your responsibility, to be her voice. And I wish you well. I hope today is as productive and receptive to you, and you learn a great deal. But more importantly, that when you've learned stuff, you go out there and you continue to save lives. Thank you very much indeed.
Thank you, Nazir, so much for that. And thank you so much, despite what's happened today, being here and being present, because that speaks volumes. And you are just incredible. I'm just so humbled that you've been here today and you've been able to take the platform and share your truths too. So huge thank yous. I'm now going to introduce our next speaker, and we're going to move on to the next segment of the Day of Memory. We're going to be moving on to honouring Paisey Mahmoud. Now, Paisey was a beautiful young woman whose life was cut short, and we have the privilege, and I say absolute privilege, to hear from Paisey's sister, Paisey Mahmoud. Now, a year ago, Paisey started speaking out and honouring Paisey's memory for the first time in May. And I remember in the room that I'm sat in now, inviting Paisey to our offices, and we sat in this room talking about Paisey. And we could have been there all day. I felt like I'd known her for a lifetime already. Paisey is one of the most incredible human beings that I've had the privilege to meet. She's so eloquent and so graceful in how she remembers and honours her sister's memory. So I'm just so grateful, Paisey, that you are here today and that we're going to hear from you next. So I'm not going to say much more than to welcome our next incredible speaker, Paisey Mahmoud.
Good morning, everyone. Thank you so much for that introduction, Natasha. I really appreciate it. I want to start off by saying thank you for having me come on Nirvana. I think I speak for all of us when I say we're not happy to be having these conversations because they are very sad and they do weigh very heavy on our hearts. But at the same time, I'm very proud to be part of an important conversation like this because it's absolutely necessary. And Natasha talked about it very briefly, but last year on this exact day was actually the very first time that I spoke publicly about my sister Paisey. And to be fair, I didn't speak much. I'm sure those of you who were there will be able to count for that. I mostly cried. And I must say a special thank you to Nazir Afzal, who stood by my side and he comforted me. So thank you so much for that, Nazir. You never really think you will be speaking at an event at any point in your life, an event that has been organized to remember someone that's been taken away from you. And when I say taken away, I mean murdered for their choices and for their basic human rights. I never ever imagined that in my wildest dreams, I would one day walk into rooms where people knew my sister's name and that they knew so much about her life and her personal and sad, significant things that had happened to her. And as Natasha said, last year, I remember being invited to Carmen Nirvana's offices. I took the train to Leeds and I had no idea what to expect. I'd never been to Leeds before. And I was met by Natasha and Anoop, and they were so lovely. And we sat all day and we just catched up. As Natasha said, it was like we'd known each other forever. They were so welcoming. And for me, it was so amazing to meet people who were doing this work and doing something so important. But the thing that struck me that I will never forget is the moment that I entered the office. There was a photo of my sister which was framed on the wall. And for me, ever since the day I lost my sister 14 years ago, I've never seen a photograph of her in our home and the place that she called home, that she was supposed to feel safe in. So I was pushed back to the moment that I last seen my sister. That picture in the Carmen Nirvana offices, my sister's eyes, her big, beautiful eyes, she just smiled at me. And I automatically traveled back in time. And I remembered the last time that I'd seen my sister alive. And that would have been January the 26th, 2006. And we were at my mother's house. We were drinking tea and we joked and we laughed and we talked until I had to say bye. And I ran into Banaz in the corridor and her hand brushed my shoulder. And that would be the last time I saw my sister. 3 months later was the next time that I saw her, when the police had recovered her body. Some of you who are with us today will know my sister's story, but for those of you who don't, I'll briefly talk to you about Banaz and who she was. She was a kind, sweet, and passionate gal, and anybody who's ever met her, even just for a few seconds, will tell you that. She was never in any trouble. She was such a simple, sweet girl, and she made my parents so proud. All my life, I would hear them saying to me, "Why don't you be a bit more like Banaz?" Or "Why don't you try to be like Banaz?" She was just a year older than me, so me and her had the smallest age gap with all my siblings. We have a very big family, quite a lot of us, but me and her were best friends. And I have so many beautiful memories of our childhood together. Whenever I think of a moment in my life, Banaz is always there. She's always present. And I never really went through anything on my own. She would walk me through all the key moments. I remember she would talk to me about periods, and she would talk to me about getting our first bras. And she would teach me so much without even realizing. She was so giving. I remember we would walk from the house to Lidl, which was about a 20-minute walk, and she would always carry all the shopping bags. She would never complain. In fact, she would actually do it so that she didn't hear me complaining. And on one of our trips, I remember telling this story to Natasha, and I'm really happy to share it with you because whenever I think of our wonderful memories, I always remember this one. Me and Banaz went to Lidl one day and we decided to buy a Lidl version of Bacardi Breezer, which was a very low alcohol percentage drink. And we thought that we would get drunk if we had one each. So we decided to buy one and we shared it. And at the time, I was 17 and she was 18 and a half. And we'd been asked to house sit my parents' home whilst they were in Kurdistan. So we drank the bottle so quickly in the garden and we were so scared that somebody would see us. It was the first time we'd ever drank alcohol. We both absolutely hated it. But we kind of convinced ourselves that we were drunk and we should probably take a nap. So that was one of our many secrets and probably our darkest secret. My sister was somebody who I confided in and she was always there for me. And I would like to think I was always there for her. We were really only split up when she was just 17 and she was coerced into marrying an older man who'd just come into the UK. He was also Kurdish, just like us, but we'd never seen him before. We'd never even heard of him. And the first time Banaz met him was the day she agreed to marry him. When my sister married, within weeks of meeting him, she moved to Birmingham. And from the start of that marriage, it was abusive. And it was no secret in our family home. We knew, the family knew what was happening, and everybody stood by and just did nothing. There were bruises. There was always a sense of tension when my sister was there and her husband was there. You could almost feel something was wrong. She was very low and you could see the suffering. And she would later go on to make domestic abuse reports, honor-based abuse reports to the police. And she would speak to her therapist about what was happening. But I'm sure you can probably guess the next part because this seems to be a running trend with these cases. My sister wasn't heard and she wasn't seen. 2 years into Banaz's marriage, she decided she couldn't take the abuse any longer and she left her marriage, went to live with my parents again. And she was finally going to be free from the abuse that she'd been suffering. She made a friend who was Ramat Soleimani, also a Kurdish man, and their friendship beautifully blossomed into a love story. But just for that, for this basic human right, she would be labeled as somebody who was bringing shame on our family. And in January 2006, Banaz's life was taken by a cold-blooded, wicked few individuals who believed that this young woman's actions weighed so heavily on their so-called honor that they felt like killing my sister was their only way to reclaim this. And so this is why my sister isn't with us anymore, because honor-based abuse was practiced to its full extent by controlling abusive and violent minds. Now, I had quite a lot of things that I wanted to say today, but then yesterday, whilst I was scrolling on Twitter, I saw something, and I saw a case about a girl called Jessica Patel, who's a 34-year-old woman, a pharmacist, who was strangled by her husband in 2018, which is exactly 12 years later after my sister's death. And what really scares me is she was around the same age as my sister and Shafilia. And what is so significant about the case is that a domestic homicide review actually concluded that that murder, which had been put down as a domestic abuse case, was in fact an honor killing. I'm sure, like a lot of you who saw that, I was completely outraged, and I went on Twitter and I let it all out. But I'll tell you why I was outraged, because for me, when I read the reports, they were words that always send shivers down my spine when I see them in these cases. And those words were, lessons will be learnt. And I always ask myself, it's been 14 years. What does that mean? And what lessons are we learning exactly? Because I don't feel lessons are being learned. We've had all these lessons. What else are we waiting for? More lessons to keep learning lessons. I say to this, and we should all say to this, we don't want any more lessons. We want action. And that is what is required to protect victims. Last year, just a couple of weeks before I was given a TED talk in December 2019, I walked into a police station, which was actually the same police station that Banaz walked into several times many years ago. And I'll never forget my sister's words, a video that was published when my sister said to the police, now that I've told you my story, what can you do for me? And she left that police station and was later a victim of an honor killing. When I sat in front of the officer all these years later, and I said to her, these are my concerns, I'm about to do this, and Paisey Mahmoud is my sister. Not only did she not know about the case, but I had to explain to the officer about the honor-based abuse, bearing in mind this is the same station where this case took place. And I can't believe I'm about to say these words that the police officer said to me with full confidence. She said to me, I know this is not what you want to hear, but unfortunately, we cannot do anything until something happens to you. And she then advised me to call 999 if I was in danger. And I walked out of that police station in a complete state of shock because I felt like I had an outer body experience. This is how my sister must have felt in those desperate moments just before her death. And she must have been so scared. She must have felt so alone. For that one moment, I felt like I walked in my sister's shoes. Except I'm still here. And I was lucky enough to have somebody in my circle who was able to support me and mentor me into the next steps of what I should do. I had a mentor at ICRO who put me in touch with the right safety measurements to have a police alarm. But how many women, how many victims of honor-based abuse have this opportunity? I can say with confidence, next to zero. And you will probably hear about this today during this conversation, about that one opportunity, that one chance, that somebody's life that is in your hands. I feel like I've attended 2 million Zoom calls in the last couple of months, which feels like years in lockdown time. And I'm sure many of you feel the same. And on so many of those calls, I've heard we need to do more. But I feel we can't keep saying we need to do more. We have to do more, especially given that now, more than ever, the numbers speak for themselves. And it's not as though we needed something to heighten the risks of honor-based abuse or forced marriage or FGM, but we have it. And it's COVID. COVID has exposed the ugly, the injustice, and the racial discrimination, especially in this sector. And we've been confronted with such an awareness, a new awareness of this, that we have to take action. The racism and the discrimination that we believe that's buried in our history a long time ago is presenting itself right now in the present, and we can't ignore it. Black and brown women have been let down again and again by the system. And there are clearly insufficient measures that are put in place to ensure critical support for victims and also services for when victims and survivors leave those scenarios. During lockdown, we all witnessed when the government launched a national campaign, which was #YouAreNotAlone. And that campaign was launched only in English, but later on circulated in various other languages. And it makes me ask myself the question, how many of those women in my own circle, including my family, would have been able to access those services? And I can't say all of them. So when we strategize and we put things in place to support women, why are they not accessible to all women? And we, of course, can't forget what we've been hearing about recently about migrant women who are facing those particular barriers in regards to facing deportation and not having access to public funds. These are all things that are stopping women accessing support, women that are affected directly by honor-based abuse. You always hear, how can I spot this? How can I do more? We need agencies and we need officials in every field to be trained about this abuse, because it's not a micro, small abuse. It is an abuse that affects so many people. It's a huge, huge problem. And I've seen more and more now, there are great and creative ways that are being explored to train people to stay alert and to ask the questions. I saw yesterday actually in the newspaper that flight attendants are now being trained to spot forced marriage victims, which is amazing. But we also need to continue doing more and put that training in so many other places. We don't have time to be cautious of cultural insensitivities, because victims need to be seen, they need to be heard. And identities shouldn't be barriers in accessing support. Me or my sister Banaz or my sister Patel, who left our family, all because of abuse and risk, we don't necessarily present as Muslim or oppressed with the hijab. So when police and authorities and officials are looking for that, they're missing the victims that are standing right in front of them. And I've told my own story various times of how many times I came across officials who could have just stepped in, just asked me the question, are you okay? Is everything okay? That could have changed my whole life. That could have possibly meant my sister is still with us today. And for me, the fact that you're all here with us in this meeting, it's absolutely amazing, and it shows that you care, so it's a great start. But we need more from you. And this is really my plea to ask you, when you leave this today, please take action. There's so much you can do. And the first thing that we all have to do is to stop assuming. One thing about honor-based abuse is that it can affect anyone, anywhere in the world. It is not this small problem that only affects people if you look like this, if you believe in this, and if you live here. It is something that we have to be open to and not be afraid to ask questions. Being afraid to offend people or to ask if somebody is okay, you actually could possibly put somebody's life in even more danger and just play the bystander. There is so much knowledge out there. There is so much information, and there are so many amazing charities who are doing the work. So it's not a case of we can't access the information, we can't access the education. ICRO, Karma Nirvana, Vera, these are just a few charities to name, but they have this information, they have the training. So if you are an individual who just wants to learn so that you are more aware, or you work somewhere and you feel all of your colleagues should be aware, or your company should be aware, you can access this information and there's nothing stopping you. We need to listen to victims, and we need to give them the space to raise these concerns. We need to believe them and stop making the same mistakes again, because so often families, communities are brought back into the picture, and victims are forced to bond their relationships with families. We have to stop doing that, and we have to listen to victims. This is something that I also probably sometime in the future I'll speak more about, but there's a huge gap in the needs of those survivors who leave, because believe me, when people leave, the risk that they are taking, the risk they are exposing themselves to, it's absolutely huge. And we can never, ever undermine that decision that is being made for the victim to step out of that situation. It takes so much. So when somebody speaks up, it takes everything in them to be able to do that. And once they are missed, they may never ever try again. That's why it's so important we always stay alert. That brings me to my next point. And I personally have been affected by child marriage, as my sister Banaz was. And for me, Banaz's future, her childhood, her dreams and aspirations were stopped and stolen the day that she was coerced to marrying this older man. And she immediately became exposed to abuse, physical, sexual, mental abuse, and all sorts. It's something that I personally feel very, very, very strongly about. And having seen the consequences of what it can lead to, I feel I need to do everything in my power to ensure that this doesn't continue happening to girls. And it does come under the on-base abuse umbrella. It's just one of the forms that we need to speak up against, because ultimately we're talking about the most vulnerable group of people in our society. And there's no confusion when it comes to children. We just don't tolerate child abuse. And so what I have today, my ask of you, is everybody that is in this meeting today, I need you to sign a petition that we have, which is live and currently has 111,000 signatures. I'm sure there's a way we can facilitate the link into this this conference, but I will be checking afterwards. So I hope all of you will be signing, because this is one way you can help. And I've mentioned the other ways you can also get involved and do your part and raise awareness and continue that conversation. That's all it takes, is every single person that's here today with us, for you to have a conversation with a friend, with a colleague, with somebody in your family, of course, safely. And that conversation just continues. So I think that brings me to the end of my part. Once again, thank you so much, Karma Nirvana, for having me and for organizing this very important day. We often hear about the abuse that victims go through and the tragic stories. And we also need to take the time to celebrate them and to remember them, and to show the amazing impact that they had on our lives. And I can definitely say my sister had such a beautiful, positive impact on my life. And she's very, very dearly missed every single day. I will leave you with a video of my sister, which will be played next. And I hope that you can all see her infectious and beautiful smile, which is missed very dearly every day. Thank you so much for having me.
Paisey, thank you so much for sharing that video with us, that raw footage of Banaz. It was absolutely moving. We're so privileged to have watched that. Thank you. Thank you for sharing as well your touching tribute to Banaz. It was absolutely beautiful. You really are honouring her memory. And just want to touch upon some of the takeaways of what you've said today. Absolutely, everybody needs to get on to the child marriage petition to sign that. That's really, really important, because Carmen Nirvana are one of the co-chairs of this campaign. We're massive advocates for it. And for people that want to support the campaign, there is information on our website that you can link to and find out. We will put the link, we'll try and put the link onto this platform so that people can click on it directly as well, if that's possible. So we'll be doing that behind the scenes. Some of the key takeaways from what you said, how much longer do we need to wait to take action? It's a really important question, because we're saying the same thing that we were saying when Banaz died, when there was an IPCC inquiry which recognised all of the failures out of her death, and we're still saying the same thing in 2020. This requires unified action. It requires all of us to be working together collaboratively on this. So together is where we make that change. So thank you, Paisey, so much for what you've shared with us today. This now takes us on to our next speaker. So our next speaker is Caroline Good. Caroline was the senior investigating officer that investigated when Banaz disappeared. So I'm going to welcome Caroline now to the platform to speak.
Thank you very much, Natasha. Can I just check that you can hear me? Great stuff. Thank you very much to Carmen Nirvana for inviting me this morning. I was really worried before coming on here that I say the same things every time I give a presentation about Banaz, and I thought surely people must be getting bored with hearing this story said in the same way over and over again. And now I've just listened to Banaz's sister telling me that she went to the same police station and no one even remembered Banaz's name. I'm absolutely horrified and mortified, and it really brings home how important it is for us all to keep telling these stories and to make sure that, I hate that expression, lessons learned, because I think most times lessons aren't learned at all. It's just a platitude. I do think we've made significant progress in the field of honour-based violence since Banaz's death, but it shows the importance that we keep on raising awareness and don't allow this just to sink back into the background. So I just wanted to focus really more on those missed opportunities that there were to have saved Banaz's life. As Paisey said, Banaz was married when she was 16 years old to a man that she barely had ever met. He was 10 years older. He had just come over to the UK from Iraq. He was illiterate and very adherent to the Kurdish culture, and he led Banaz a dog's life. He repeatedly physically and sexually abused her. And as Paisey said, that the family were made aware about that, but they sent her back to try harder to be a better wife to her husband. But eventually she couldn't stand that anymore, and she came back to live with her family in London. And that was the first contact that she had with police. She reported to West Midlands Police about the multiple rape and the physical abuse that she had suffered at the hands of her husband. A video interview was conducted with Banaz. It's very, very moving. If you get the chance to watch the documentary Banaz, A Love Story by Dia Khan, you'll see an excerpt of that interview on there. And very touchingly, she says at the end, now I've given you this statement, what can you do for me? And the honest answer is that nothing was done for Banaz on that occasion whatsoever. Now, for a police officer, investigating a rape, other than a murder where someone's life is actually taken, a rape's just got to be about the most serious offence that someone can report to you, and it requires, the greatest level and urgency of investigation. And absolutely nothing happened about that rape and physical abuse allegation. The transcript of the video interview wasn't even written up for many, many months. There were no investigations made whatsoever to try and trace the perpetrator. Banaz was just allowed to go on her way and nothing happened. And significantly, also in that interview, she said, "Men are following me. They mean to do me harm." And nothing was done about that whatsoever. So then, as Paisey has described, Payman started a relationship with another man. He was Ramat Suleimani, much closer to Banaz in age. He was very westernized, lovely looking young man, lovely sense of humor. The pair of them were absolutely besotted with each other. But it was a relationship that was never going to be allowed to continue. Ramat was warned off in no uncertain terms by Banaz's father. "You will stop seeing my daughter." Banaz was also warned, but young people being what they are, they took no notice and they carried on seeing each other until they were eventually captured kissing outside an underground station in South London. And the way that it works in that particular society is that sometimes women are followed by the men and they're caught out doing something that breaches that perceived infraction of the moral code, and then young men will report that behaviour back into the family as a way of raising their own status. And that's what happened with Banaz and Ramat. They were seen together by some cousins of Banaz and reported back to her uncle, Ari Mahmoud. And the following day, Ari Mahmoud rang Banaz's mother and he told her, in his words, "That bitch and that bastard are going to die." Excuse the language, it's a direct quote. "They're bringing shame on the family." So Banaz then came into a police station in South London, probably the same one that Paisey is talking about, and reported that threat to her life. Now, on that occasion, she said she didn't want the police to take any action because she was worried. If she said, "Don't come round, don't speak to my mum because my mum won't speak to you. Don't arrest Ari because that will make things much worse." She was really, really worried that any police action might actually make the situation worse. And it's a fear that a lot of women in the same position would have. But that doesn't mean that the police couldn't do anything for her. And in fact, all that they did do was to get her to sign a statement saying that she didn't want to take action, and then allowed her to go on her way. And there was no plan put in place to try and keep her safe. So even if a victim of crime is unwilling to engage with you, there's always something that you can do as a police officer to keep someone safe. There should have been a plan put in place, and it just simply didn't happen. A short while later, Banaz brought in a letter naming some of the people that she had heard were going to be responsible for killing her. The letter was handed over to the person at the police station, and absolutely nothing happened with that letter. It wasn't sealed and exhibited in the way that it should have been. It wasn't brought to the attention of an investigating officer. It was simply posted into someone's correspondence tray and not seen for several days. Well, eventually, when a detective did find the letter, he tried to contact Banaz, but he did what we now recommend to people that they don't do, which is come round to Banaz's home address and try to interview her about that when her parents were still present at the house. And she met the detective on the doorstep, wouldn't allow them past the doorstep, wouldn't allow them to speak to mom. And the police officer went on his way, not able to make any progress with the case. And then on New Year's Eve that year, there was then an attempt to murder Banaz by her own father. And what happened was that he took her to Grandma's address on the pretext of sorting out her divorce from her first husband. And obviously that was something that Banaz really wanted to happen. And he drove to Grandma's house by a circuitous route, avoiding all the CCTV. And he got Banaz to switch off her mobile phone and to hand over the phone to her dad. And then when they arrived at Grandma's house, he made her carry a suitcase into the house. Now, this is particularly cynical because in all probability, it's the suitcase that Banaz ended up in once she had been murdered. But once they were inside, Banaz's father got her to drink a bottle of brandy, and this was, as you've heard from Paisey, that other than the Bacardi Breezer, was not something that Banaz would normally have done, was to drink a bottle of brandy. And when he felt that she was sufficiently stupefied, he told her to watch the television, don't turn around, don't look at what I'm doing. Well, she did sneak a look over her shoulder, and she caught Dad creeping up on her wearing rubber gloves and training shoes, and she knew that she was going to be murdered. Somehow she managed to escape from the back of the house. She plunged her hands through the next door neighbour's window to try and get attention. And when that wasn't successful, she staggered off up the road and collapsed on the floor of a nearby cafe, telling the people in there, call the police, my dad's just tried to kill me. Call my boyfriend, they'll kill him as well. Still, even in that state, she was really concerned for Ramat. The police were called, and I'm ashamed to tell you that the police officer that turned up simply didn't believe what she was being told. She saw, to this day, I don't understand why it was that she just simply didn't believe. This is a young woman, it's New Year's Eve, freezing cold. She had on a t-shirt and a pair of jeans. She had nothing on her feet, no jumper, no coat, no bag, no phone. And she was bleeding from the hands, from her wrists, where she had plunged her hands through the next door neighbour's window. So what part of that is there not to believe? I think perhaps the officer just thought it was a New Year's Eve drunk, and we do see a lot on New Year's Eve. But either way, she didn't listen, she prejudged, and she just wrote Banaz off as a time waster, as a drunk. And she put in her notes that she thought Banaz was melodramatic, and she thought she was making the whole thing up just to get her boyfriend's attention. She even threatened to arrest her for criminal damage to the next door neighbour's window, and told her, apparently according to ambulance staff, shut up or I'll nick you. A few weeks later, there was then an attempt to abduct and murder Ramat Suleimani, the boyfriend. Ramat was at a friend's house, and a car pulled up containing 4 men, and 3 of those were people that Banaz had named in her letter that were going to kill her. They tried to get him to come into the car, but were prevented from doing so by Ramat's friends. And they said, okay, Ramat, we can't take you now, but we are going to come back, and we are going to kill you and Banaz. You can't carry on doing what you're doing. You're not English, you're Kurdish and Muslim, and you're going to die. Well, on that occasion, both Banaz and Ramat went to 2 separate police stations to report it. And this time, Banaz had had enough. And she said, I'm now willing to support a prosecution. I just can't go on like this anymore. And the officer that dealt with her then tried everything she could to get Banaz to come into a place of safety, but Banaz thought she would be safe to go home that night. And she said, no, I'm going to go home. My mum is there. My mum won't let anything happen to me. And sadly, we know now that Banaz was murdered the following morning at her home address. So many chances to have saved Banaz's life were missed. And I can't honestly say that Banaz would still be alive if things had been done differently, but there's a very, very good chance that she would have been. And of course, normally people don't get 5 chances to save a life. We've already heard about, by the time people come to police, normally many, many incidents have already happened. If they come into the police or any other statutory agency and they're not believed or they're not looked after, there's very little chance that people will come back a second time, and mostly you will only get 1 chance to save a life. So that's really what I wanted to say about the missed opportunities from the police, but also there were other opportunities missed, because Banaz she was known to health, she was known to education, she was known to social services. Once things had gone horribly wrong, it became apparent that this family were known to all of the agencies and the dots just hadn't been joined. Ignorance around honour-based violence also made it very difficult for me to actually investigate the case. It was presented to me as a missing person. We didn't know to start with that Banaz had been murdered. I knew absolutely nothing about honour-based violence at all. It was compounded by the fact that we were getting a lot of false information from members of the Kurdish community, people that were reporting that, oh, they'd seen Banaz when in fact she was already dead, people confessing to her murder that had already gone back to Iraq and couldn't be interviewed. There were just numerous different things that happened to try and derail the investigation. When you don't even know the truth of what happens or the facts about what happens during honour-based violence, it's very difficult to try and sort the wheat from the chaff. So it's really this education, this action that Paisey talked about is so absolutely vitally needed to keep the momentum going, to actually force change, to make sure that other opportunities aren't missed. And one other thing before I go, because I think my time is coming up, is that I just wanted to talk very briefly about this book that I have written about the Banaz investigation. It's called Honour: Achieving Justice for Banaz Mahmoud. And there are two main reasons that I wrote that book. I'll put the link up to it later. And one of them was to ensure that these lessons are continue to be learned, that we continue to raise awareness, because it's really clear that we need to keep reinforcing this message. And if we just think, oh, well, I've told people once that the world's going to change, well, it just isn't. And the second reason I wrote that book was to try to keep Banaz's memory alive. What happens with, as Nazir said earlier, families try to erase that person's memory. And Banaz's uncle Ari, actually, he used those words. He said, let her name not be spoken, let it be as if she had never lived. Well, I'm not going to allow that to happen. I think every time we say her name, we're making sure that his wishes are thwarted, and we will never forget Banaz and all of the other victims of honour-based violence, and we honour them all here today. Thank you again for inviting me, Carmen Nirvana.
Thank you, Caroline. That was incredibly powerful. And, you know, Caroline, you're really a role model to all the officers out there that are sat watching this today, because you said that you didn't know anything about honour-based abuse. But the difference is you made it your duty to find out. And that is what is so incredible about you. You went, you know, to the ends of the earth to really get justice for Banaz, and that is really felt. So thank you so much for sharing that and sharing your truth with Banaz. So we are now going to move into the next segment of today. But before we do, I just want to say that we have nearly 800 people that are registered to today's event. So more than I had anticipated. I said 700 at the beginning. And the questions are coming through. So please keep sending those questions through. We're pinning them. And like I said at the beginning, if you have questions for anybody in particular, please do reference their name so that we can pin that question for them. So we're going to move on to the next section now today, which is honouring the memory of Shafilia Ahmed. We have the privilege today of hearing from Melissa Harrigan, who is the school friend to Shafilia Ahmed. Now, we honour this day on Shafilia's birthday. Today would have been Shafilia's 34th birthday, and she isn't here. We are here to honour her memory, and I'm going to now pass over to Melissa to tell us a little bit more about Shafilia, who she was, because the sad reality is we only know about Banaz and Shafilia for the stories that we've heard as a result of the tragic thing that happened to them, and we've seen the pictures that were then in all the front pages of papers and all over the internet. So today is about honouring them for who they were before that point in time. It's honouring their memory. So I'm going to hand over now to Melissa to honour Shafilia Ahmed. Sorry, Melissa, you're just on mute. If you take yourself off mute, apologies.
There we go, hopefully. Everyone hear me? Lovely. Hi, so thank you so much, everybody that has signed on today. That it's like amazing, really. And you kind of, when you think about the times that we're going through at the moment, it's been really hard for everybody, but it makes you realise that there is good coming out of these difficult times of this pandemic, because so many more people are able to hear Shaf's story, Banaz's story, But what frightens me when I just say those two names is Shaf and Banaz. They were just two of many people that have suffered at the hands of honour-based abuse and that have lost their lives. And what frightens me is that a lot of those stories as well we'll never ever get to hear about, because often in these communities and deaths like this and the abuse of these people, of people like Shaf and Banaz, just they're never heard of, and that's really quite a frightening concept to me. So some of you may have heard me talk about Shaf before, and by the way, I call her Shaf, and we all called her Shaf. That's what she liked to be known as, but of course formally I do mean Shafilia, but I will refer to her as Shaf throughout. So some of you may have heard Shaf's story before, and you may have heard me talk about it in the past, so I apologize if it feels like I'm repeating myself to you. But the key thing there is that we have to keep Shaf's story alive, and we have to keep drawing everybody's attention back to that. We mustn't forget her, because she is really, for me, an inspiration in that because of her, lives have been saved, and I like to think that something positive has come from her death, and it's really important just to remember that. So I'll start by telling you a little bit about Shaf and how I got to know her. I first really got to know her in year 10 of high school, but we became really close friends towards the end of year 11, and then especially in sixth form, when we had a number of classes together, and we spent all of our free time in the common room, just talking about just gossip, music, celebrities, fashion, boys, as you do at that age. And one thing I always remember is we laughed so much. She really had an amazing sense of humour. She was really sarcastic. She really kind of gave banter its meaning for me. And I guess that's maybe why we got on so well and why we had such a close friendship group. We just enjoyed spending time with each other. And she was really bright. She wanted to be a lawyer, and she definitely would have achieved that. I've absolutely no doubt about it, because she had the drive, she had the brains, and she definitely had the determination as well. She was really confident, but she wasn't cocky. She was well behaved. She was studious. She worked really hard on her schoolwork, and teachers liked her. She was just a really likeable individual, and she knew exactly what she wanted in life. And really, she was just your average girly teenager who enjoyed spending time with her friends, enjoyed going to college. But the more and more we got to know her, we realised that being around her friends and being at college, that was her escapism from the abuse that she was experiencing at home. At first, this abuse came, it sounds strange, looking back at this, but this abuse came in the form of funny stories that she would try and make us laugh at. She'd talk about how strict her parents were with her growing up and how controlling they were of her. They didn't like how westernized she was, despite the fact she was born here and she was raised here. And I mean, we'd hear about how she was convinced that her parents hated her, and they couldn't wait to get her married off. We'd hear how her sister joked that she'd been adopted, and she was from her father's first marriage, which was it was a bit of a taboo subject, really. But she really, in some extent, I think she started to convince herself that maybe she was adopted. I remember one time she told us how her mother in particular was that strict that she remembered at the age of 4 years old being forced to sit on the front step outside. She was actually kicked out of the house for misbehaving, as you know, as 4-year-olds do, and she was forced to sit outside on the front step as a punishment until her father arrived home. Now, I mean, that to me is obviously, I have children myself, and the thought of punishing or abusing your 4-year-old daughter in that way is absolutely terrifying. But the way she told this story, we were kind of mortified, but it was this disbelief, and I suppose certainly a nervous laughter between us, that we couldn't believe these things that she was telling us. I remember one time she told us how her mother had smacked her on the back with a broom in response to Shaf chatting back to her about something, and Shaf quite dramatically and intentionally responded by chucking an entire glass of milk across the kitchen that she was holding at the time, and she had all these actions of how this happened, and the milk went everywhere, and she was laughing about this, and it was funny, because the way, that's who she was. She just used to try and make light of every situation. But all this time she was telling us these things that were happening, or had happened in the past, and it's really unnerving to think that actually those things had gone on. And although she tried to make light of them and tried to make us laugh, I guess that was her way of informing us of what was going on at home. And she'd laugh when she would sort of say this, I guess, again, like a nervous laugh. And I'm quoting here, she'd say, "Honestly, Mel, they will kill me one day. They will kill me." And I was, I guess, maybe naive. And I was saying, really? Surely not, you know. They sound awful, but you really think they'll kill you? Because I didn't understand that culture that she had been raised in, and neither did the rest of our friends. It was something extremely foreign to us. We just didn't really get it. But then quite suddenly things started to get a lot more serious, and I remember the specific day that they did. Shaf she was found on a park that was on the way to school by a fellow student. She was freezing. She wasn't wrapped up. She barely had any clothes on her to keep her warm, because she'd actually managed to escape in the early hours of the morning after she'd been forced to stay at home for over a week, so that the bruises on her neck that were still visible at this point could heal. And now Shaf was someone, she never ever took time off school, so that to us was strange at that point. And then of course when she did come in and she still had these marks on her neck, things changed, and we really started to see that things were very serious. And no matter then how much she tried to make light of the situation, it wasn't the same, and we had to keep drawing her back to the fact that this isn't okay. Suddenly the threat of marriage as well had become very real, and it no longer seemed like a threat. They were planning her wedding to a distant cousin in Pakistan, and they were looking at flights, and even one of her siblings was telling her she needed to leave now, and that was quite a frightening concept. For her to kind of advise her to do that, this was one of her sisters who was younger than her, and she was saying, you know, you've got to leave. They're planning this. You've got to go now. So overnight, it really felt like Shaf, myself, and our other friends, we all changed from these really carefree teenagers that would laugh at the expense of each other to a group of girls that were now genuinely so worried that our friend would be shipped off, and she would be forced to marry against her will at 16. I mean, 16 years old, that's so young to marry. I've been a teacher for 10 years and I'm yet to meet a 16-year-old that's mature enough to marry somebody at that age, and that importantly would want to marry somebody at that age. So this was a really, really frightening concept. So at that point, we then started to plan her escape, and we kind of put everything into this. We were going to help her get away from her parents because, as I say, it wasn't a threat anymore. It was happening. It felt very real. Now, a couple of things to remember here. Firstly, I mean, forced marriage didn't become illegal in the UK until 2014, so it wasn't officially kind of made a crime. And this was in 2002. We'll actually be going into 2003 at this point. So what that meant was, as a UK citizen who had lived here all her life, she could have been taken abroad, forced to marry someone against her will, and the police could, it seemed, could essentially do nothing about it. Secondly, for Shaf to get protection from her parents, she would have to have gone to the police herself and would have to claim that they were abusing her, that her life was at threat, that she needed protection. And even then, would the police have believed her? Probably not, from experience of seeing what others, of hearing what others have gone through. But as well, she was 16, so even though she was technically classed as an adult, she was still a very vulnerable young individual. So you would think for somebody so desperate, that sort of option would have been easy, but it wasn't. And then thirdly, Shaf had been conditioned to believe that she must never ever bring shame on her family, and she talked a lot about shame, and that was something that was really important to her family and important to her. And she knew that there were serious consequences if she were to go against her parents' wishes, or if she was to bring shame on the family, as she would always say. So we helped her to escape. So that her parents wouldn't become suspicious, she began by bringing small bags of clothing bit by bit into college, and she would store them in our lockers. We then started to plan where she was going to stay. So one night she would stay at my house, and she'd stay at other friends' houses, just so they couldn't track her down so easily. And sure enough, they turned up at our doors, her parents, and demanding for us to tell them where she was. And we just had to say, we don't know, I've not heard from her. We informed our head of year what we were doing. She then organised for us to stay in hotels and bed sits, whilst attempting with the relevant organisations to find her a more permanent place of residence. And like, by the way, at this point, like, even now, like, I can't, and myself and my friends, we can't thank that teacher's efforts, our head of year's efforts, enough, because she really, really did do everything in her power to try and protect Shaf. And I know that Shaf was so grateful for everything that teacher did and the emotional support that she provided her with. But looking back, in terms of things that were missed, it was those other organisations that I just feel they could have done more. They could have acted quicker. They could have believed her story, advised her more. And if they'd have worked alongside our teacher, who were just doing everything for her, maybe she would have been saved, and maybe she would have felt confident enough and safe enough to stay away from home, because it was still a really daunting prospect for her. So then next, after some whispered phone calls in the evening, in the middle of the night, with Shaf, she escaped through a window, and she managed to get away. Then in the days that followed, Shaf she seemed her usual self. She seemed relieved. She seemed really free and uplifted, because she felt that she'd escaped that imminent chance that she was going to be married off. But this sort of freedom and that uplifted spirit was really short-lived, as while she was away, she looked into her bank account where she'd been storing, saving lots of money. She had a part-time job in a call center. So she'd been saving all of this money, which was going to help her as she'd got away. And she found that there was hardly any of that money left, and we're talking like thousands. And her parents had been using her bank card. They had a spare one, and they'd been taking out the money from her account. So that really that was a huge blow for her, because she suddenly felt now she had nothing. She had no money. She had very few clothes. She didn't have a secure roof over her head at this point. So everything began to get very real. She was also being continuously harassed by phone calls and text messages from her parents, and they were relentless. They weren't giving up. She did pluck up the courage to answer the phone sometimes, and it would be her mother on the phone. And one minute she'd be crying her eyes out to Shaf, and she'd be pleading with her to come home. And the next minute she'd be screaming and shouting vile abuse at her. Because what we realised later is that they had a husband waiting for her in Pakistan, and they were soon ready to leave for her wedding. So there was panic there. They needed her to come home, because otherwise they had no control over the situation, and they weren't able to have her married. In particular, I remember we were staying in a hotel one evening, and we were sat on the edge of her bed, and Shaf was sobbing as they'd put her youngest sister on the phone. And her youngest sister, she honestly, she adored her youngest sister, and she always used to say how, even though her sister was so much younger than her, she reminded her so much of Shaf, and she was worried that she would one day experience the same abuse that she had experienced, and that they would marry her as well. And she was questioning Shaf, where are you? Please come home. I miss you. And it broke her heart. And it was these things that were kind of pulling her back, despite that she was in so much danger at home, and despite they were going to take her against her will to marry this man. She still had these things pulling her back, and she was being manipulated into going home. And then one morning we were on our way to college. We were still going into college. It was quite safe in that the bus stop, we were getting the bus there, was very close to the school, to college entrance. And so we were on our way to college this one morning. It was about 2 weeks that she was away. And this particular morning, we spotted her father's car, and it was parked on the other side of the road. And he was sat in the driver's seat waiting for her to arrive. And the next thing, he just really calmly turned the car around, and he pulled up next to us. And you'd think at that point that Shaf would have ran, but the fear that overcame her just rooted her to the spot. She could not move, and she was physically shaking, and she just kept saying to me, don't let him take me. Please don't let him take me, Mel. Please don't let him take me. And I was saying, run, just run. And I was trying to pull her, but she just couldn't move. She was shaking. And he walked up to us really calmly, and he took her by the arm, and she was crying, saying, please don't let him take me. And he just pushed me out the way, and he said, you keep out of it, you. And he put her in the car, and again she was like looking at me through the window, and she was crying her eyes out, and she was saying again, just please help me, please, Mel, please. And I couldn't do anything. And that day really kind of sticks with me, and just fills me with dread every time I think of it, because at that point I then ran to school. I was absolutely hysterical. I couldn't get my words out, and the poor reception ladies were saying, what's happened, and I just kept repeating, he's got her. Word quickly then got to our head of year, and she called the police, and the police came in. But then really shortly after the police arrived, the police arrived, and then So did Shaf and her father. So he brought her back into school, and she had a smile on her face. And she explained that they'd convinced her that everything was going to be okay. They'd apologised to her for how they treated her in the past. Her mum had been on her hands and knees at her feet, begging her to come home and crying and saying, you can marry whoever you want to marry, and you can go to college, you can do whatever you want to do. And she believed them. She believed that everything really was going to be okay. And it was, we were just beside ourselves. I remember each of us, myself and 3 other friends, we were just crying, asking her, why is she going back? What are you doing? Like, can't you see what they're doing to you? You're in danger. But they convinced her, and she's like, no, honestly, it's going to be okay. It's going to be fine. I said I can marry who I want, when I want. But it was actually 2 weeks later that they drugged her. They put a sedative in her orange juice in the morning, and then they flew her to Pakistan to be married. We had no notice of that. She suspected nothing. And it was, as I say, just 2 weeks after they'd convinced her to go home. And really, that day sticks out for me because I feel like that was the point when everything that she'd managed to get away, she'd managed to escape, and then when they manipulated her into going back, that was the point when they won. And it was at that point she was just, we couldn't help her, and there was nothing that we could do. They phoned school to say that I believe that their nan had been taken poorly, and they had to go over there and kind of be by her deathbed. Now, this is quite a common lie, and a red flag for teachers in education, because it's quite a common excuse, and it's kind of just accepted without question that this young individual has to go abroad for 2 months, maybe longer, because they have a sick relative, and it's a real red flag that is often missed by schools. Now, we'd never actually see her in person again. When her siblings returned, one of her sisters actually said to me, oh, she didn't want to come back. Shaf wanted to stay there. It was the same. It's the same as over here. She loves it. She just didn't want to come back. And we knew that was a lie. But again, there was nothing that we could do. We weren't in contact with her. We just felt helpless. There was absolutely nothing that we could do. It was then 7 months later when a friend of mine actually told me she'd bumped into Shaf at another college in Warrington, and it was right at the beginning of term in September. She said she'd seen her, and I was amazed. I couldn't believe it, and I was like, oh my gosh, she's back, she's safe, fantastic. She really quickly put us in touch, and then the next day I spoke to Shaf on the phone, and just hearing her voice, I remember it so clearly, and it was her, and it sounded like her normal self again, that bubbly individual. And she told me, oh yeah, they tried to marry me off, and then she said, but my nan actually stuck up for me. This is the nan that was apparently on her deathbed, I assume, as well. But her nan, of all people, had actually stuck up for her and said, listen, if she doesn't want to marry, she doesn't want to marry. Now, Shaf actually told me at that point on the phone that she'd been back for quite a few months. I think she'd come back in the May, so it was about 5 months that she'd been back. And I learned that she'd been extremely poorly. She told me actually she'd had a collapsed lung, as she'd had food poisoning in Pakistan, and she'd been in and out of hospital. I remember she was around other people that she didn't know too well around this, with this friend of mine that didn't know much about the situation at all. So that the reason she was so poorly, I found out later, is because she'd actually drunk bleach as an act of desperation so that she could escape her hell, the hell that she was presented with of marrying somebody that she didn't want to marry at such a young age. So she drank that bleach because then potentially she became damaged goods to that groom. So she also informed me things hadn't been too bad recently. She hadn't asked to go anywhere, so I guess that would explain that. She'd just been at home. But despite the fact that she'd gone against her parents' wishes, it seemed that things were okay. A group of us arranged to meet the following day on the 11th of September. But unfortunately, we had to cancel our plans as we couldn't actually get over there. The person that was meant to be driving was stuck in a lesson, so we couldn't make it over to see her. So on the 11th of September, we spoke for the last time, and we arranged to meet the following week. On the Friday, she couldn't because she had another appointment at the hospital, so we arranged to meet on the Monday or the Tuesday. And I knew I wouldn't hear anything from her over the weekend because her parents wouldn't have been happy if she knew that she was in contact with old friends. So, as I say, we didn't speak to her again. And then it was that night that her parents actually killed her. Her mum, it was her mum's instruction to her father to finish it. It was quoted to finish it. And then at that point, he stuffed a plastic bag down her throat to suffocate her. And then he drove our beautiful friend to a location where her body was disposed of like unwanted rubbish. Following Monday, I didn't hear from her, and I instantly knew that something was wrong. I reported it to our head of year, who she informed the police of her concerns, and they went round to her parents' house. They claimed that she'd run away, so they were washing their hands of her. They wanted nothing to do with her anymore, and that's why they hadn't reported her as missing. Now, I like to think that when the police turned up to their door, that they got the shock of their life, because they wouldn't have known that we had got back in contact just days prior to her death. And I feel if we hadn't have got back in touch, then they may have just got away with it. As the new college that she'd been enrolled in, she'd only been there a few days. Therefore, they were unlikely to go banging on the door to question why a college student had decided not to return. So they would have got away with it. Now, 6 months then passed. She was reported as a missing person, again by ourselves, not by her parents. And we just didn't know. Was she alive? Had she run away somewhere? Had she got help elsewhere? We had no idea. And then it was in February that my friends and I, we were ushered into a room, and we were told by a lovely head of year and by the police that a body had been found, and had been found by a river in Kendal, and it had been partially covered up, and it was indeed Shaf. We ourselves, we knew straight away what had happened to her. There was no doubt. We knew that it was her parents. We knew that they'd taken her life. But it took 10 years until justice was finally served. But thanks to the tireless efforts of everyone involved at Cheshire Police, and in particular Geraint Jones, who never gave up fighting for her, justice was eventually served, and her parents were sent down to for a very, very long time. And in that 10 years, it was awful. You'd be shopping, you'd go into Tesco, or you'd be walking around town, and you'd see them, and they'd look over at you, and the smugness on their face, and they'd look directly at you, as if to say, well, we got away with it and there's nothing you can do about it. And it was just like a punch to the stomach every time you saw them just walking around free. But as I say, you know, thankfully, justice was served and they got what was coming to them. Now, I often find myself questioning, were there things that could have been done differently, and what were the opportunities that were missed? And I find myself questioning, why didn't the police get involved more on the day that she was returned to school? Why didn't they take her to one side and speak to her individually and find out more about what was happening? Did they look at her and just think she was a silly runaway teenager that got into an argument with her parents? I question why airport staff, who I imagine looked at her and must have seen a very frightened and drowsy individual, because remember she had been drugged. Why didn't they look at her and think something's not right there? Why didn't the nurses at the hospital on her many appointments question this very suspicious excuse for why she drank bleach, that there had been a blackout and she thought she was drinking orange juice? Why didn't they question her further and check she was okay and report these incidents to the relevant people? And each time when I think about this, I come back over and over again to the same outcome. And I think they were concerned because they were worried that they would be accused of being prejudiced, and they were worried about getting involved in something that they perceived was just part of a culture that they didn't understand. So it wasn't their place to get involved. But this was a young, vulnerable girl who desperately needed help. So that there's definitely so much to be learned from that, because if things had been done differently, if the right support had been out there, she might still be here. To kind of finish with on this note, this is, I feel, one of the most important things. When we think about abuse, there's no question around it. Abuse is abuse. It doesn't matter what your cultural background is, what your religious beliefs are, what your ethnicity is. Abuse is abuse, so we must not turn our backs on anyone that's desperate for help. And I know, I'm a teacher myself, and as teachers, we receive safeguarding training that helps us to be able to recognise signs of abuse, signs of neglect, physical abuse, emotional abuse, sexual abuse. So just because somebody has been brought up in a different culture, that doesn't change the fact that someone is being abused. We can't step back and be worried about what people think, and we'll be worried about offending parents or putting our noses where they don't belong, because abuse is abuse at the end of the day. There's nothing changes that. So for anybody, so teachers, police, nurses, airport staff, careers officers, counsellors, the list just goes on. We should be doing everything in our power to protect anybody that we suspect is at risk of honour-based abuse, because it's clearly a huge problem. The statistics of how honour-based abuse is still going on now is really quite frightening, and how young males and females are being forced into marriage against their will and taken away and murdered because they brought shame on the family. It's still happening, and we live in 2020. So yeah, but thank you so much again to everybody that has signed on today. I know that Shaf would be so proud to think that because of her story, things have changed, but there's so much more still to be done. And so thank you, Carmen Nirvana, for bringing light to that fact. And thank you for all of your efforts. Thank you.
Thank you, Melissa. That was incredible. You ended on a real powerful note there of we're talking here essentially about abuse. We're not talking about things that we need to be sensitive about. And at Calm Nirvana, we often hear from practitioners that don't have the confidence to tackle honor-based abuse because of some of the communities where it happens. They think they have to be sensitive. And we're not talking about sensitive issues. You hit the nail on the head. We're talking about abuse. So thank you so much for sharing that. And thank you so much for sharing that beautiful memory of Shafilia. You've really given it as a sense of who she was and the beautiful person that she was. So we're incredibly grateful for you speaking today. So this takes us now on to our next speaker, Geraint Jones. Now, Geraint was the SIO, the Senior Investigation Officer, as you heard from Melissa, and we pay tribute to officers like Geraint, like Caroline, that have fought tooth and nail to get justice in some of these most horrific cases that we're hearing about today. So I'm now going to welcome to the platform Geraint Jones.
Thank you, Natasha. Can I just say it's a privilege to be here this morning. But really, I'm not worthy to follow all them speakers. I think that's, coming at the back end of what we've just heard from Melissa and everyone else before. It's sort of, I'm just here just to sort of talk a little bit at the end. Really, a real sense of humbleness compared to the sort of bravery, siblings and friends of people who've been murdered in this way. It just pales into significance what we do in some ways. But I think it is an important thing to talk about to everyone as well about what we should be doing, what we have done, and maybe a bit of reflection as well. So in regards to the Shafilia case itself first, I became involved in it in October 2003. But as we've heard from Mel, the sort of Shafilia story starts well before then, and it actually starts before she was born. The sort of factors in this family, her father, Iftikhar, he came to Europe, to Denmark as a young man. He came with his uncle, pretending that uncle was his father, and he lived a merry life in Denmark, in Copenhagen, where he was out drinking, smoking, living a lifestyle. In fact, he married a local lady to Copenhagen and became a father there to a young son. So if the westernized lifestyle, but he got a call to go home to his village in Uttam in Gujarat in Pakistan to say that his grandmother was ill, and he went back to Pakistan, where he became a bigamist. He married Fazana, his first cousin, and stayed in Pakistan for several months. In fact, whilst in Pakistan, he contacted his European wife to say he wants to move to the UK, and she moved in to their house in Bradford whilst Iftikhar remained in Pakistan. Iftikhar returned to Bradford and carried on his marriage with his first wife, but also in this house was a heavily pregnant woman who she didn't talk too much until one day this woman wasn't very well and they needed to get a doctor. Now, Iftikhar's first wife acted as a bit of interpreter because she picked up a bit of the language, and to her horror she found out that this heavily pregnant woman was Fazana, who Iftikhar had married in Pakistan and was actually carrying a baby, and that baby is Shafilia. So she packed her bags and went back to Denmark, and from that day really Iftikhar became a different man. He became a tyrant together with Fazana. They left Bradford not long after that and set up house in Warrington, where they had four further children, notably Alicia, who was the second eldest child, and I'll come to her later. So Shafilia grew up, as we've heard from Vanessa, and I think what we see is sort of a real striking change in sort of 2002. So Shafilia's gone through her GCSEs. She's not had an easy life. I think they were strict parents, but no one really took note of how serious it was at home. I think looking back, these are young girls as well. The bravery of them is quite remarkable, and the lengths they went to try and protect their close friend. But they were just 16, 17-year-old girls. And, you know, from a background that you just wouldn't get this. But anyway, it was going on at home, serious abuse, which escalated really to them deciding to control Shafilia through marriage or through isolation or through lockdown or wherever it was, whether that was in the UK or Pakistan. I don't think there was much sort of planning involved to start with. I think they sort of had a loose plan that she would be sort of married off to a cousin, perhaps, to control her. I think that was the main factor, though, is that they wanted to control her, and they were using physical and mental abuse, and then maybe marriage. So anyway, we get to a point where it's escalating, and Shafilia is running away from home to try and escape the tyranny. She makes friends with a boy who sort of tries to protect her a bit as well, but he's a bit older. And that obviously winds him up even more. But as we've heard from Melissa, they took her back. She was kidnapped basically from outside school. And that one is a real telling moment. Yeah, there is other reports, you know, local authority, emergency housing, reporting through school to social care. There are elements there, but not to make Shafilia probably a worked with child at that point. But the real telling moment really was outside school, where he has kidnapped her. He's taken her away by force, taken her home. Police are contacted, and 2 police officers are involved. Now, those police officers, I know them, they're conscientious officers, but they just had no grasp of this issue. And they attended at school. Iftikhar brought her back to school, and he made big promises to say that there's no marriage, that she's staying at home, and he's not going to do that now. So mediation, that probably took 5 minutes, I suppose, is what we're talking about there, and lack of understanding. Now, this was 2003. I don't make an excuse for that, but it was 2003, and much has changed, but not enough. But anyway, within that short period of time, yeah, Shafilia has a little bit of a freedom, but in the background, they're already plotting what's going on. As we've heard, she was taken to Pakistan, stupefied, taken to Pakistan, and remained in Pakistan until the end of May 2003. So she had a period of time there, 3 months, and in that period of time, she drank a caustic substance. Now, you talk about bleach, it's probably a lot stronger than that. It's probably a drain and blocker or something like that, because it severely burnt her esophagus to an extent that when she came back into the UK, she couldn't take fluids virtually. Now, we don't know what happened there. We know she was taken there, and we know that the family came back, leaving her there. They left the sort of second youngest to her, Mevish, they left her with her. The others all came home in dribs and drabs, leaving Shafilia out there with extended relatives. For some reason, she was flown back. Now, it may well be the family over there didn't want to take responsibility for a British citizen dying in Pakistan. I don't know, but I presume something like that happened, because there's a flurry of phone calls, some pressure exerted, and she returns home. And when she returns home, she's taken by ambulance to Warrington Hospital, where she's treated for this esophageal stricture and goes through a period of operations. She's fed by a tube for a while, but eventually she gains her strength. Now, during her whole time in hospital through that summer, what you've faced with there is a 17-year-old girl with clear self-harm, possibly suicidal attempt, but no real trigger anywhere. What they describe in the hospital was a real vigil by mum. Mum is by her side constantly, very protective, and I think aggressive. And I think that way is sort of portrayed by both of them as well. When school or any other agency have been around them, they're met with aggression. And that aggression has got them some way to stopping anyone finding out really what's going on. And people sort of come away from that through lack of understanding or sort of fear. No excuse for it. But it seems to be that family were able to influence outside by that approach. She comes home, she's better, and into that sort of early week in September, back in Priestley College, was different, a couple of miles from where her original school was. I think there may have been some agreement there with the family that she couldn't go back to her original school because they were protectors. Clearly, that they knew the background, so she went back. Now, the week leading up to her murder, there are some triggers. We've heard Mel there not even knowing she was back in the UK until that week. She fatally probably uses her brother's mobile phone to make some contacts. Her phone was taken off her. She used her brother's phone. Now, we don't know if they uncovered who she'd been ringing. She did make contact with the lad that she'd been meeting with when she ran away from home earlier on in the year. She was seen on the last night of her life. She was seen outside work with an Asian lad who worked with her. When Mum picked her up from outside work, she was stood with him. Now, we know that night she was taken home and murdered. Melissa's gone into that. I don't need to go into the details further of that murder, only to say that it was done in front of all her siblings. So they all witnessed the murder. Now, the little sister was very young at the time. The others weren't so young. And that's really telling, really, in that they did that, but that never broke out for several years before her. So Alicia, probably the bravest person I've encountered in policing, came forward and gave the key bit of evidence that added to all the other evidence to convict them. But when you look at this journey through and during the investigation as well, the aggression of the family, the allegations of racism by the police or social stereotyping, solicitors representing them going live on television in press conferences, and on it went in terms of their sort of challenge. They put up a reward for the killers to be found. They challenged the verdict of the coroner around an unlawful killing. It was a relentless sort of approach they had to try and get people to keep off. Iftikhar himself as well, in terms of the local Islamic Association, he was on the committee, and his power increased as well. And there was, I would say, 3 camps there in Warrington at the time. There was a camp that thought he did it, didn't agree with it, and then there's another group who sort of kept distance. But there was definitely a core there as well who probably had a good idea, did it, and agreed with it. And and that is at the crux of some of this, is that acceptable behaviour. Murdering a child, you really question that, but there are people out there who agree with this. And during my journey of this over the 9 years, I encountered people with that sort of mindset. We also encountered some fantastic people, and so the inquiry team that we were all engaged with this. It was a real fine balance between making false judgments about people. We met some really strong people standing up against this, and indeed outside of the investigation, going back really to 2004. I remember up in Glasgow, I first met Jasvinder and then Steve Allen, who was then leading this, and we sort of started to form the honour-based abuse, sort of honour-based violence as it was then, working group, and that was back in 2004. We heard Nazir talk about the conference we had, and that was again at the end of 2004. We've had some other things, legislation in 2000, 2007, 2008, forced marriage protection legislation. We've had the Home Affairs Select Committee. We've had the HMIC review in 2015. And yeah, there's some good stuff gone on. But actually, when you wind the clock back to 2003 and look at the events there, could we actually honestly say, across all agencies now, would we stop that? I think there are still cracks there, and days like today really make a difference in enabling us to talk to 700 people, and hopefully that 700 talk to another 700, and the more we talk, the better it is. But also in terms of the infrastructure to be able to react, we talk about Shafilia there being sort of 16, 17. What is available there? When someone is really at high risk, what specialism is there? Where do we support people, even more so when they've got no recourse to sort of support? How do we do that? Real challenge, and these cases come, and during my time, I've retired 2 years now, but I was sort of involved in this till the day I finished, really. And from now and again, a case would come, and I'd get involved in, and you'd see the same sort of patterns. You'd see the behaviours there, and it is Nazir talked about this before, a criminal enterprise or an organised crime approach. This is how they are. They're unbelievably resilient. They believe what they're doing is right, and they will network and act as organised criminals do to carry out their dreadful acts. So we've got to keep the fight. We've got to keep challenging that. We've got to challenge the establishment. We've got to, there's some really brave people out there doing so, but we need more brave people to come to that. But what I would like to do is end really with some words from Shafilia. I think is really important to, and this is called Happy Families, and it's that, Shafilia said, "I don't pretend like we're a happy family, perfect. The desire to live is burning. My stomach is turning, but all they talk about is honour. I was like a normal teenage kid, didn't ask too much. I just wanted to fit in. But my culture was different, but my family ignored. Now I'm sitting here playing happy families, still crying tears, but we're not a happy family. I have these fears. I wish I were a happy family. I lay in bed hoping for the next day would never come. It was just a thought, because it never happened, no. But I still dream of this day, yeah. I wish my parents would be proud of what I've done. Instead, you've brought shame or something else lame. I don't want to hear this no more." And I can't top that. I think those stay with us. And thank you very much for the opportunity of talking today. Any little bit will help, and credit to everyone involved. Keep going, and glad to be here. Thank you.
Thank you, Jan. That was incredibly powerful, and huge credit to you and everything that you did to get justice for Shafilia. You gave us a really good plotted history there of progress, and actually how there have been moments in time where progress has been made, but then we're still here in 2020 asking the same question. Paisey said, we've got lessons to learn. We're still asking why. We're still saying the same thing. One of the things I wanted to comment on was when Shafilia was murdered and the judges summing up in 2012, the judge, and this was the first time in history in a judge's summing up, the judge actually referenced that honour as a motivation was an aggravating feature to the sentence. So aggravating meaning it increases the sentence. Yet in 2003, when we saw the death of Heshu Yones, we saw that actually honour was used as a mitigating feature, that it actually reduced a father's sentence, because the judge commented in that particular case that he could understand how this father was torn between two cultures. But years down the line, we've seen some progress, but still so much progress to be made. And I really want to thank you, Geraint, for sharing everything that you've shared with us today. That's been incredibly powerful, and also to say a huge thank you to Paisey, Caroline and Melissa for a very thoughtful, very insightful and touching tribute to honour both Banaz and Shafilia. So reflections. When we reflect on what we've heard today, the phrase missed opportunities is very relevant. We've heard about the fact that we've missed all the signs of honour-based abuse. And in fact, we've missed the opportunities to reach out in a meaningful way, because we can't really reach out meaningfully if we don't understand the experience. We heard Banaz on 5 occasions went to police, 5 different separate occasions, even wrote a letter to identify who she thought would murder her. And in fact, that letter was the letter that helped the investigation once she became missing. We heard about Shafilia, again, multiple occasions of going missing, reports to police, social care, housing, school. Again, all the signs were missed. And I suppose this leads us to ask ourselves the question, why? Why is it that we're still missing all of these opportunities? Was it a case of the fact that agencies just simply didn't care enough? Well, I think that we know that evidently isn't true. We've heard from the likes of Caroline and Geraint and how powerful they've been in terms of seeking justice for both Banaz and Shafilia. Is it a case that victims of honour-based abuse aren't coming forward? Well, actually, we've just heard, haven't we, about Banaz and Shafilia coming forward and speaking their truths on multiple occasions. So it takes us back to this question of why. And I think that there are many reasons as to why honour-based abuse is missed. I think some of these reasons are systemic, and we could have a whole webinar on the why. But I think overwhelmingly what is lacking here is confidence. I think there's lacking confidence from victims and survivors to speak out. There is still so much stigma attached to speaking out. Many people often worry about bringing shame on families and communities, which prevents them from speaking out. And sadly, as we've heard, many frontline practitioners don't have the confidence to call out honour-based abuse. We are still hearing from practitioners who are worried about causing offence or worried about how they deal with cultural sensitivities and actually don't always recognise the abuse when it takes place in certain communities. And I think that the only way that we can raise confidence for both victims and survivors is about talking about honour-based abuse. It's about making it more familiar, making it less taboo to talk about, helping people to recognise it, whether you're a victim, a survivor, or a professional. For victims, we need to be reducing the stigma. We need to be taking away that shame element of speaking out, because there is no shame in speaking out. And for professionals, we need to be taking away the sensitivities when essentially we're talking about abuse. So there is still so much progress to be made to make honour-based abuse less taboo, more accessible, more recognisable. And we all, every single person that is on this webinar has a collective duty to play a role in this. We're all accountable to shining the spotlight on honour-based abuse. So this now takes me to the slideshow, which should be appearing on your screen. Now, whether you're a teacher, whether you're a police officer or a member of the public, we all have a role to play. And as part of the Day of Memory, the Carmen of Honour team have designed a comms toolkit, which is your gift for today. It's an opportunity. I call it a gift because it's an opportunity for you to shine the spotlight. The link that will be on the side of the box that I'm speaking out of is available to you for you to access the comms toolkit, and it will take you directly to the toolkit on our website. So on the next slide, so how can you contribute? Well, there are 3 different ways that you can contribute. We've developed digital assets for Twitter, Facebook and Instagram. And what we would love today is if each and every one of you could join our Spotlight Hour between 2 and 3 p.m. today. If you could just share one of those images in the digital asset toolkit on your social media channel during that hour, it would be amazing if we could get honour-based abuse trending. We could really get the spotlight shining on this issue on a huge scale. We've got to be mindful that whilst we're also trying to educate people, these assets are going to be reaching out to people who may be going through something. It may just prick a conscience that actually, yeah, this is abuse. Or it could be that a professional who hasn't had the curiosity or confidence to ask questions will be guided to think, actually, okay, I'm going to ask about this issue or this case that I've got. I've spoken at so many events where we ask at the beginning of an event, how many people have dealt with a case of honour-based abuse? And you'll find that hardly anybody puts their hand up. But when you talk about the issues and when you raise awareness, when you ask that same question at the end of the event, everybody puts their hand up and say, well, actually, on reflection, yes, I've had this case, but I didn't recognise it was honour-based abuse. So by raising awareness and shining the spotlight, you're making people more aware and more conscious of the issues. We've created assets that are universal, so they're universal that they can appeal to a general audience, but there are also some specific assets that are focused to a victim audience for somebody who may be affected by these issues, or professional audience for somebody who may be working in the sector. So between 2 and 3 p.m. today, I really implore all of you to download one asset, you pick which one, and retweet it across your social media networks. Our comms team will be looking out for every post where that you've shared an image and you've shared the suggested post. We'll be retweeting that across our channels too, to really amplify those messages. So that's way number 1. Way number 2 that you can shine the spotlight, we've developed a presentation for all of you today. It's an accessible presentation that can be delivered within 30 minutes. What it provides is a taster session on what honour-based abuse is and where to get help. Now, this could be delivered in one of your team meetings at work. It could be delivered in one of your quiz nights during the lockdown, that we're having many of those during the lockdown. So you've got lots of opportunities. It's 30 minutes long, and we're developing some presentation facilitator guidance for you to deliver that confidently. And finally, the third way that you can shine the spotlight on honor-based abuse is by sharing survivor stories. You know, we've heard today from Melissa and Paisey sharing the stories of Banaz and Shafilia. You know, survivor stories are inspirational and they serve to empower all. Whether you're a victim of honor-based abuse, you know, you learn through these stories that actually you're not alone and that help is available. If you're a professional, you learn that these are the challenges that people have faced and what is my role in support, protection and safeguarding. So you now have all these incredible opportunities to shine the spotlight on honor-based abuse. And what we know is when we look at history, whenever we've shined the spotlight on issues, we always increase reporting. There was a great fear that when forced marriage became a crime, that it would drive the issue underground, when in fact, the year that forced marriage was actually just spoken about becoming a crime in the next year, so 2013, we saw reporting levels go up massively. That wasn't because it was happening more during that year. It was because we shone the spotlight on the issue, which made it more accessible for people to understand it and for people to come forward. So please, please, please do get involved in the comms toolkit and share those assets away. So this now takes us into our second poll. And the question in this poll, which should hopefully be coming up on your screen now, is how are you going to shine the spotlight? Are you going to either share one of the assets? Are you going to do a presentation? Are you going to share a survivor story, or do all? So I'm going to give you a few seconds to come into that poll. Once you've put your answers through, I'll be getting those up on my screen. I'm multitasking with the dashboard and the camera. So please do enter your answers into that poll, because we all have a duty, as I said, to be accountable to raising the spotlight, shining the spotlight, making this issue less taboo, reducing that stigma. There is still far too much stigma around honor-based abuse, that until we make people comfortable to come forward and until we give professionals the confidence to challenge, that's the only time that we're really going to make a difference. So there's a slight delay whilst we get those poll results in. Just want to take this opportunity to say that if you have any more questions that you want to ask to any of our panel members, we're going to be moving on to that section next. So please get those questions through to our team. We've been moderating them throughout the day and have got loads of fantastic questions. Lots of people commenting about how fantastic the speakers have been today and how it's been really moving to hear from all of our speakers, really, and how we've really been able to honour their memory. So waiting still on the poll results to come through, which may be any second now. And if it's not, oh, we've got them through. So the poll results then, overwhelmingly, we've got 57% of you that have agreed to share the assets, 21% that have said that you're going to deliver the presentation. That's fantastic. And we've got 25% of you, 25.62% of you that have said you're going to share the survivor stories. So thank you. And an overwhelming number of you that are going to do all three. That is incredible. Thank you. These are our takeaways from today. These are the things, you know, it's great, isn't it, to come along to a webinar like this, to hear these empowering stories. That's all well and good. It's fantastic and inspiring. But actually, what are we going to do from today? Where do we pay this forward? So I'm really pleased to see that we have such a huge commitment to paying this forward. Okay, we're now going to move on. I'm going to get the questions up that you've been posting throughout the day. So let's go to the first question. Right, we have a question and I'll pose this question to Paisey. What can be done to encourage more victims to come forward? We think about those that are afraid to speak up. What would you suggest to those that are afraid?
I think you need to know that you are not alone and seek help safely. As I said in my talk, there are amazing people who are doing so much work and dedicating their lives to supporting victims who suffer from honor-based abuse. Of course, you have Nirvana, who are supportive. You have ICRO, you have Vera. So just do a little search, or if you follow Karma Nirvana on social media or any of the charities I mentioned, and reach out to somebody. There is help out there. And I completely understand why victims would feel that they may not have the confidence, or they may be scared to come out and, you know, seek help. That's completely understandable. But I just want you to know that you are not alone. And even though today we've spoken about cases where things have unfortunately ended in devastating ways, there is support out there, and please don't be discouraged. It's just all about seeking support safely, and it is out there. You are not alone.
Thank you, Paisey. Our next question is for Melissa. Melissa, somebody sent a question to say that they thank you for your input, that you're a great friend, and they really resonate with Shaf. Shaf was the same age as this person that's posted the question, and also from the same community. She wondered whether you're still in touch, if you are in touch with any of Shaf's siblings, particularly the one that gave evidence, or do you know how they're doing since Shaf's death?
It's unfortunately no. We're not in touch with any of them. I know Alicia, the one thing I would say to her if I could, and I know that our friends feel the same, is that we're just so grateful that she was brave enough to step forward in the end and to give evidence against her parents, because I think without her, justice wouldn't have been served. She was kind of the missing key that the police needed, really, to be able to move forward with her case. So, but yeah, unfortunately, I'm not in touch with her or any of the others.
Thank you, Melissa. Our next question is to Nazir. Nazir, this question is, should faith leaders do more to tackle honor-based abuse and forced marriage, as they do hold some influence over faith communities?
Absolutely. Whenever there's a significant news story, a terrible murder, they will do stuff. You'll see them giving sermons or public announcements or speaking at events, but then almost immediately afterwards, everything goes quiet. So I'm not going to generalize. There are some great faith leaders doing work 24/7, 365 days a year, but the vast majority, in my view, only do so when the spotlight is on them, which is the word of the day. And I think that this is where, again, we have responsibilities here. With the 700 of us on this webinar, go and identify a local faith leader, have a conversation with him or her, usually him, I suspect, about what it is, what they've done, hold them to account for what they will do in the future. And that's how we've got to be relentless, and we can't simply expect them to do so. They also have challenges too, in the sense that I remember one faith leader saying to me, the moment I mentioned it, his congregation went down by 50%, and they went across the road to another faith leader, and that means he didn't have in his view, the incentive. But if we held the one across the road to account, then there would be nowhere for people to go. And so I think we have a responsibility to identify the good people who are doing some good work all the time, but also to hold to account those who aren't doing enough. And I think the message of your question is absolutely clear. They have responsibilities here. People do listen to them. People do believe what they have to say, and they stand by what they have to say. So therefore, being strong community voices, we should be working with them and, as I say, holding them to account.
Thank you, Nazir. Absolutely agree with that. Our next question is for Garan. Garan, why did it take 10 years to bring Shaf's parents to justice, please?
Yeah, so we sort of put a case together in 2004 and 2005 to sort of seek a prosecution, looking at all the evidence we had at the time. And it was at a time where we were challenged in relation to the admissibility of what we'd say as the sort of cultural evidence. That was a challenge for us, and we did take it all the way to sort of eminent QC to give us a review of the case, and we got to a point where it was really close, but the pillars of the case stood up on. There was one or two frail ones, and I suppose at the time, and frustrating for us, I thought we had enough evidence, but I'm the person who gets the evidence, not reviews it. So I know Nazir and I had long conversations about this sort of thing, and it was a frustrating time. We then went through a sort of coronial process where the coroner made the verdict of unlawful killing. Family challenged that, and that went to the Supreme Court. So we actually had plenty of proof that Shafilia was unlawfully killed. It was just, you need a strong possibility. Now, you talk about beyond reasonable doubt, that's for the jury, but for the prosecutor's code, we needed to satisfy that there was a realistic prospect of conviction here. And if we lost certain elements of the case, we may have lost it at half time. And Alicia, obviously, it took that length of time for her to be brave enough to come forward, and with her evidence, again, there was vulnerabilities in her evidence, but with all the other evidence that came with it, we managed to secure the prosecution. It did take a while from 2010 to sort of 2012, from that sort of evidence first breaking to actually getting the slot in the Crown Court to get the trial through, and it took till August 2012 to get the conviction. But we were faced with real challenges, where Shafilia was murdered. They knew what they were doing. They planned. Certainly wasn't just a spur of the moment thing. There was a lot of plans put in place. And the body deposition where Shafilia was put, we didn't find Shafilia till the February. We lost most of the evidence was gone. We were, the forensic evidence that you'd normally have, very little of that, telecommunication evidence and all that sort of stuff that you normally get wasn't there. So it was just a real battle to try and get sufficient. But again, whether it took a month or 9 years, in the end, they're in prison. But the important thing, as I suppose, is that in them 9 years, it was talked about all the time. We kept the case up there. It was not one. It's difficult sometimes when you haven't got a prosecution to talk publicly, and you got to really push the line. And I think we took a bit of a risk there sometimes in sort of trial by media, but we got there. Yeah, it was 9 years of my life. I wish it hadn't been 9 years, but justice did prevail in the end.
Thank you for that. That takes me to another question that we've been asked, and it's been asked of me around the number of prosecutions that have been dropping year upon year. It's interesting that despite more victims coming forward to report honour-based abuse than ever, the number of prosecutions have been dropping. And the question is, why do we think that is so? And I think there are multiple reasons for that. I used to work as a prosecutor before coming into the sector, and some of the points that Grant has just made, there are some evidential issues that you need to give consideration to. But if you think about an investigation and you think about knowledge and awareness, just to put it simply, if you have a police officer who isn't able to detect honour-based abuse, the struggle that you will have is then identifying that motive. It will be very difficult to tell a story if you haven't identified that motive and the investigation has been honour related at a trial to a jury of 12 lay people who may have never come across the concept of honour before. So it's very often the case that actually we're missing that motive very, very early on. And there's another question about what needs to be done, and are all police forces trained on honour-based abuse? Well, the reality is that no, they are not. And as I alluded to at the beginning, 2015 inspection of police identified that only 3 forces were prepared to respond to honour-based abuse. I was one of the peer inspectors in that inspection. And it was quite shocking, actually. It was a very damning report, and I'd really encourage, as a takeaway from today, for people to go onto the inspection website and have a read through that, because there are a number of recommendations that were made that in 2020 have still not been implemented. And we've been asking HMIC, we've asked the Home Office, because the Home Secretary can instigate another inspection in her own right, for a second inspection, but we're yet to see that happen. So there's lots and lots that needs to be done. The next question is for Caroline. So Caroline, somebody's put, thank you so much for your input and determination in Banaz's case. As a fellow detective in the Met Police and the honour-based abuse forced marriage spark, is there anything more you would recommend that could help bring awareness and education to fellow colleagues and bosses for this hidden yet serious offence, please? Many thanks.
For me, it's about education, education, education. One of the things that worries me most at the moment is the decline in numbers of police in the first instance, because that means that I think that the police officers are dashing from one incident to another, and they don't necessarily have the time to sit and listen and take real care with the victim that is required in these particular cases, because it does take a bit of patience and it does, take a bit of time. Another thing that happens when budgets are cut is that one of the first things that goes is training. I would really love to hear from people all over the country. I was asking this question on Twitter this morning, what training goes on with new recruits into honour-based violence? Are people getting it, or are all frontline responders getting that training in the first place? But also there's such a high turnover of police officers. Whereas it used to be like a 30-year career when Geraint and I joined, people now only serve for shorter terms, and because you get that turnover of police officers, you don't get that corporate memory, so there aren't the people there with the expertise that can guide other officers. So I think we need to keep on with the training. We need to engage with our absolutely excellent third sector partners, because we can't do this on our own. And I can tell you that there were 3 agencies in particular that were invaluable to me during the Banaz investigation, that we simply wouldn't have got that result if we hadn't worked together with our partners. So engagement and education are the 2 big ones for me. And carry on the fight, detective, whoever you are, because I'm gone. You're the one on the front line and you're the one that's got to do this.
Thank you, Caroline. Thank you for answering that question. Going to move on to the next question. This is from Melissa. What could schools do to support and help? And were there any teachers you could speak to or trust as an issue? So were there teachers that you couldn't trust?
No, there was certainly no teachers that we couldn't trust, but we had one teacher that Shaf did speak to a lot and went to for help, and she was amazing. But I know, sort of as a teacher myself, and certainly using that experience to try and reflect on the kind of teacher that I am, and being able to look out for cases where young individuals are experiencing abuse, whether that be honour-based abuse or any other kind of abuse. One thing that kind of really sticks out for me is that what I've noticed is kind of whenever I've tried to raise awareness of honour-based abuse myself in schools that I've worked in, I've come up against a brick wall, because the head teacher has said to me, but it's not a problem here. We don't have we don't have that problem. There's no students that are kind of suffering from that, and really quite confidently kind of shut me down and didn't want to go down that avenue, didn't want to try and provide more staff training on the matter. And it's quite frightening that actually it's overlooked so easily, especially in schools where ethnic minorities are low. So I think we had about 10 students in our year group of about 250 students that were from an ethnic minority group. So schools like that are similar, the frightening thing is that it is perceived as not being a problem, but also that there's too much concern about how parents may become offended if people get involved, and that's one of the biggest things for me. So I don't think it's a case of teachers not believing, but it's just being aware that it's not about offending people, and actually there are lives out there that need supporting, that there are young individuals that need their help, and they need to feel confident and safe to be able to go to any of those teachers and know that that help is always going to be there. But they just need to be, they need to make sure that they're not concerned about offending anyone. That's one of the main things that always crops up for me.
Thank you, Melissa. Our next question is for Paisey. Paisey, since Banaz was taken from you, have you found that there's been any changes within your community towards their treatment towards girls and women, or has it become more secretive and difficult to discuss these topics? Thank you so much for speaking.
I believe it's really hard to answer yes or no to that question, because I believe there has definitely, after my sister's death, there has been, you can't deny the impact that this has had on the community, and the fact that everybody knows about it and knows how tragic this story is. So I think I do often get messages from people on social media saying to me, I was 13 or I was 14 when I heard about your sister's case, and that really sparked a conversation in my family. So there'll be Kurdish girls who will message me, young girls. So there's definitely that. Within my immediate community, if I'm honest with you, I don't believe that I've seen a change with my eyes in the community. However, I think there's still a lot that we need to do. I'm seeing a wave of the next generation of young people from my community who online are very vocal and who are very passionate about change. So that for me has been so positive to see. And I feel like since I've started campaigning, there's almost a community of us online who are having these conversations with their families. So I'm pleased to say that I am seeing that, and I just hope it continues. So yeah.
Thank you, Paisey. Next question's a quick question for Caroline. Caroline, was the officer that saw Banaz in that incident that you recalled in the cafe, was she sacked? And if she was or wasn't, how do you feel about that?
The answer is that she wasn't sacked. She was actually promoted and got 2 years back pay. The reason there was an investigation by the Independent Police Complaints Committee that I feel was not a very thorough investigation. When it came to the hearing, I think Ramat Suleimani didn't want to give evidence. There were plenty of other witnesses that could have been called that weren't called, and the result was that the officer in the case was just given words of advice, and that's all there is to it. She was just given words of advice on her behaviour. But how do I feel about it? I think that was nowhere near strong enough. I think we're almost looking at professional malfeasance because of the way, the terribly, terribly disrespectful way that she treated Banaz on that occasion. And I just want to say that is such a tiny, tiny minority of police officers that, is not the way that I would expect most police officers to deal with a victim of crime. The overwhelming majority of people, I'm going to say 99.9% of people that join the police do that because they want to serve their community and they want to make a difference. They don't always get things right, and I hope when I went through the catalogue of errors, I was able to show that most of them were trying to do the right thing, but didn't do the right thing out of perhaps ignorance. And it was just that one officer who treated Banaz with terrible disrespect. So no, I don't think it was anywhere near strong enough. But that's what happened.
Thank you, Caroline. Paisey, would you just like to come in and comment on that as well?
Yes, of course, Natasha. Thank you. I think for me, that scene and the question in relation to that officer is probably something that will haunt me for the rest of my life. I remember meeting the officer at the scene who actually met with my parents in the location which my sister had described, where her life was about to be taken. And the officer actually used me as an official translator for my parents. So there I was, 17 years old, and I was doing the translation between my parents and the police officer and trying to communicate that my sister, who had just accused my father of trying to take her life, was drunk, and as far as the officer was concerned, that she was just misbehaving and she was just being a typical teenager who had been drinking. So, like I said, I think it will haunt me for the rest of my life, because the way it was dealt with, the lack of concern that she had for my sister's health and my sister's well-being, and also for putting me into that situation, of course, with my parents in a very pressurized, very, very horrible, traumatic position to be in. I cannot begin to, even just accept it mentally, how she thought any of that was a good idea. So it just haunts me. And I really do hope, echoing Caroline's words, that there is very, very, very few police officers who would even think of doing something like that. The thought that would even cross their minds. I would hope, and I would, believe that not a single officer would ever treat a case like this in that way. And I just hope always that all these lessons in my sister's case will go on to be used as training for police officers of what never, ever, under any circumstance, what to do. Thank you, Natasha.
Thank you, Paisey. We've got so many questions. I just want to highlight that I'm not going to answer any of the questions for Carmen, Nirvana, or for myself. What I will do after the event is go onto Twitter and put the questions out and answer to them, so that I can answer all those questions and we can give as much airtime to our speakers today. That's really, really important. We've had lots of questions as well about the HMIC inspection. The other thing we will do is we will add that to our socials on Twitter and Facebook so people can access that. And we'll also link the child marriage petition as well on social. So another question, Nazir, don't know whether you would mind answering this question. What role do you think that doctors play in identifying honour-based abuse? Are they doing enough? We've heard quite a bit about health practitioners that could have heard, looked out for signs and they haven't. Do you think that they're doing enough, and what else could they do?
It feeds into what has been said by others. I think around about 2010, 11, 12, largely because of the work that followed on from Banaz's terrible murder, you had national guidelines for policing, national guidelines for prosecution. You had social services, children's services, GPs. You and me and your mother went up and down the country talking to organisation after organisation, scaring the living daylights out of them to get them to change their policies, bring in new guidelines. All of that happened, and it was making tremendous progress. What's of course happened, and we can't get away from it, is we've had a decade of austerity. Don't want to get party political. Let's get political though, which has meant that the money's just not there. And so the training that you've just identified, it's really beggars belief that KN's training has got to 3 forces or however many forces when there are 43 forces, and the same thing can be said for the Royal College GPs. I can't remember the last time I did any training with them. The National Midwives Council, I did training at their conference a couple of years ago. There is, again, the phrase I used earlier on, relentless. It must be day in, day out. They must have it on their priorities list every year for a refresher training for staff, because you have to think about it. I think we must have heard it today. The victims would probably only have one opportunity to talk about their experience, what's happening to them, and it may well be in the privacy of a doctor's surgery or a privacy of a DWP appointment or a midwife or something. And if that individual doesn't do anything with the information they've got, then, well, they've failed. and they will potentially have failed that person so much so that person might lose their lives and certainly will suffer harm. So we have a responsibility, and I think, you know, Caroline mentioned that the reduction in police officers, 20-odd thousand police officers. That's 500,000 years of experience lost. You know, that will not be replaced by 20,000 new officers coming out of training school. So we've got to train them. We've got to ensure that every agency, every organization has the same impetus and commitment that they had maybe a decade ago, in order for us to be able to find some assurance that we will get better at dealing with these kinds of things.
Thank you, Nazir. And just on the back of that health question, I'd just like to highlight that during the lockdown, Carmen Nirvana were approached by NHS safeguarding as a result of the fact that the lockdown has increased the number of reports of honour-based abuse to midwives, for the fact that people are now attending these appointments on their own, they're isolated, so they have opportunity to speak out. So there have been some trusts in England and Wales that have seen increases by up to 25%. Equally, we've also been approached by Mary Stopes to say that they have seen increases by up to 33% of people seeking a termination on the back of honour-based abuse. So the lockdown in many respects has increased reporting. One question that I will answer that somebody has asked is about whether contacts to the helpline have increased during the lockdown. Like the domestic abuse helpline, contacts to our helpline have also increased by up to 200%. And I'll be honest, we were quite surprised, because when we think about honour-based abuse, we know that victims are in a lockdown with multiple perpetrators, making it increasingly difficult for them to seek help. And I think what this spells out to us is their sheer desperation during this time to get help. And I've said to a number of journalists, I don't believe that until we return and resume to some sort of normality where people are accessing services and children are back in school in September, will we know the scale of the damage that the lockdown has caused to some of our more hidden communities, hidden because of the stigma, hidden because we're not reaching in meaningfully. So I think we've got a lot to learn post-lockdown. I'll take one more question. We've got so many questions, and I'm going to speak to our panel at the end to see whether I could pin the questions to them and whether they wouldn't mind sharing some answers, which we can then put onto our website. Lots of comments about the day being so powerful. All the speakers have been thanked, that they've been so moving and eye-opening. I will share all of that with you speakers after today. One question here. I'm going to put this question back to Nazir. That question's just, oh no, here it is. So we need a culture shift around risk and around honour-based abuse. How can we really change culture around honour-based abuse, Nazir? What are your thoughts?
Well, culture is one person at a time. You change cultures one person at a time, and that what we were talking about within the schools and education. We're missing a real trick here. When God willing the schools come back to some level of normality in September, it should be mainstreamed. The idea of the curriculum being relationship education, that kind of stuff being mainstream, so that young people from an early stage become aware of the signs, become aware of what they can do and what responsibilities they carry. Also to ensure that we don't have future perpetrators, so they get to understand, gender equality, issues of that nature. So I think there's a lot of work that we can do in the schools. Again, Jaswinder will undoubtedly remember the number of times that she tried to get into a school and the governors prevented her from doing so because, to make a point, it's not an issue for us. Well, that's a nonsense. We need to make it mandatory. We need to make sure that in education, every child gets an understanding of not just this issue, but the whole issue of gender-based violence and gender equality. And then with the elders, with the older people, we've got to ensure that we take every opportunity. So I think the media have responsibilities. I think that so-called community leaders have responsibilities. We touched earlier on faith leaders. It requires everybody to make an effort and continue to make that effort in order for the change to happen. But it won't happen in one generation. We've seen seismic difference since 2004-5, haven't we, Natasha? But we've slipped back somewhat over the last 4 or 5 years, largely because of funding. But we need to move forward, and we can move forward together. Because I think we're all committed, and I think the 700 people on this webinar certainly is a great force for good.
Thank you, Nazir. I just want to read one more pin message that's come through and say a big thank you to another ally of Carmen Nirvana. That's Nicole Jacobs, the Domestic Abuse Commissioner. And one of Nicole's takeaways from today is to support another HMIC inspection and support us in that call. So thank you, Nicole. I'm really, really happy about that. And thank you for extending that support. Just one other comment. We were quite conscious as well. People have said that they thought that the 3 hours was going to be quite a long time to be sat listening, but actually, on the contrary, it's flown by. And that's a credit to all of our speakers today. So thank you. So that then takes us to the final closing word of the day, the final thought and reflection. I'm going to hand over now to our incredible founder, my mother, Jasvinder Sanghera.
Hello. I hope you can you hear me, Natasha?
We can hear you, but you need to put your camera on if that's possible.
Oh, you need to see me. Hang on. I'm starting the camera. Camera is on. Oh, you can see me. I can't. Okay, great. Wow. Okay. Can we breathe now, please? And can I remind us how we all bleed the same colour and how we're in this together, united we stand. And they're direct quotes from the people who are moved in the Black Lives Matter movement. We are speaking in this level of consciousness, in this time, in this era. And as I'm sat here and I reflect, and this is my moment, thank you for the platform, Carmen Nirvana, to reflect on the journey of how we got here. That's what I'm feeling, Carmen Nirvana's journey, but also the fact that survivors are tuning into this. And I just want to say something directly to you first. I want to remind you of this, and listening to Natasha open and telling you all she's my daughter, I felt immense pride, but equally I felt immense hope. And again, for me personally, it reaffirmed to me the decision I made when I was 16 years old, that it was the right decision. Because what you don't know when you're 16 and you say no to a forced marriage or honour abuse is you're making that decision for future generations. You're creating new legacies for your children in the future. And if anything, do it for that very reason. There are times, survivors, when that which is most familiar to us will present the most challenging opposition, our family. We want our family to support us. We want our family to encourage our dreams. But sometimes we have to step out alone. And in that space, I don't underestimate the immense courage it takes, that stepping out alone to create a new path for you, for others to follow. And if your family choose to stay on the same old beaten path, there is no obligation for you to march with them. That's what I want to say to you. And to the practitioners listening today, the over 45% of you that have tuned in from the statutory sector, the third sector, the friends, the neighbours, we need you to march with us. We need you to be on that path with us. Melissa said, why? You know, why are people feeling there's not a place to get involved because of the fear of prejudice? You know, again, I'm going back to Black Lives Matter. This is the same campaign, the same voice that we're hearing. Melissa said, and I quote you, Melissa, "Put your noses where it does not belong. Abuse is abuse." She appealed to teachers, counsellors, police, etc. Put your nose where you don't think it belongs. What's the worst case scenario? You get it wrong, but at least you tried.
To the investigators listening, the one thing I note very clearly about Caroline and Geraint and the investigators that I've come across in my time investigating these crimes is that they were like a dog with a bone when they were investigating. They accepted their limitations, you know, their ignorances about the subject matter. But what they did was they thought outside the box. They made it part of their business to seek expert advice, to go and ask the questions. It didn't stop them. So they carried on like a dog with a bone, and that's what you need to do. And these are your peers as well. I'm sure both of them and others will be more than happy for you to connect with them if you need that guidance and you need that advice. You know, I sit here and I think about the actual Day of Memory itself and why I felt compelled to want to have such a day almost 9 years ago. And I remember it was when I was looking at and hearing about Shafilia's story and thinking, and this is Natasha, was born the same year. She was the same person. She was articulate. She had an ambition to be a lawyer. I get to see my daughter do that, but Shafilia will never achieve that. And I remember going to Warrington and, you know, going to the library, the old library on a Sunday with my friend, and we'd like research the story with the old acetates and sat there, and the librarians really curious about why I was there. And some of them saying that they were told not to help me. And then going to Shafilia's school, actually, to pass on my book for the library, and a hand put to my face and told, "We don't want to talk to you." And I said, "I'm not a reporter. I just want to commend her bravery and want people to remember her." And I had a hand put in my face. And then I went to where she was buried and saw the headstone. "Here lies our beautiful daughter." They buried her knowing what they had done to her. And it really made me feel compelled to tell the world, we've got to remember Shafilia and others. Because ordinarily, when somebody dies in such a tragic way, the whole community comes out and speaks out for that person. But one of the things I noticed in my campaigning years of over 28 years is these women are not remembered. People might remember them silently. I know it takes courage, but really there isn't the noise that we really want to hear. And that's what needs to happen. And that's why the day was important. I also want to say that there is something about honour abuse and forced marriage being still not mainstreamed. It's still on any other business. It's not part of the conversation. I remember when the Home Secretary, Theresa May, announced a domestic abuse inspection of all 43 police forces. And I wrote to her personally and I asked her if that inspection was going to include forced marriage and honour abuse. She told me it wasn't. And I asked her, why are we always the poor relation? And that led to the conversation with Sir Tom Windsor about the inspection. But then I also remember more recently, and Paisey referred to this, and I know Natasha, Carmen and Nirvana have campaigned and have supported them over the weeks. Government launched a domestic abuse campaign. But where was forced marriage and honour-based abuse? They've had to raise their voices to make this part of the campaign. The point I'm making is this becomes an afterthought. And it's just not good enough. It needs to be part of the conversation. It needs to be mainstreamed. I just want to touch on what Melissa said about some of the indicators, because what some of you may not know is Melissa was one of the key prosecution witnesses. 2 days of giving evidence in that trial of her friend Shaf, the personal account that she gave so movingly to us all. Made me feel like I know her more as well. So thank you for that, Melissa. But one of the things that strikes me is the importance of friends when we are building investigations, because what the police are up against very often is a brick wall, and the evidence might not come from within that family. You know, they didn't see anything, they didn't hear anything. So really, the people that the police are really going to be needing to also talk to are friends, teachers, neighbours. You're key in this conversation. And Melissa also makes the point about the red flags, the indicators. Absence was one of them. You know, it was unusual for Shafilia not to be at school. So right now, we are in the summer holidays. How many of you have a hunch about somebody that may not be in this country or may be at risk of a forced marriage? And how many of you have followed that lead? Because sometimes that curiosity, that professional curiosity you have with the conversations of the people in the know, like Carmen, Nirvana, ICRO, the investigators who are qualified in this, etc., might take you to that place of actually recognizing actually what you're seeing is a forced marriage, is a child marriage. So please bear that in mind in the summer holidays. And you think about when schools open, how many children will not be on our school rolls? In 2008, I remember raising it with the then PM, how over 100 school children went missing off one school roll in one academic year. Just like that, they vanished. Nobody asked where they had gone. These were South Asian girls. And I remember the police officer raising it at the time, got sidelined, got put to one side for raising that question. I made the point that if over 100 white British teenagers went missing off our school rolls in this country, we would be jumping up and down. We didn't jump up and down then because the attitude was very much, it's what they do. You know, we don't want to rock the boat, you know, that multicultural boat. I don't want to be called a racist. And that was why people looked the other way. Let me be very clear. In the same way, Durant's investigation wasn't hindered, but what the family tried to do was intimidate the police by accusing them of racial stereotyping, by accusing them of not being culturally sensitive, etc., etc. This is what families will do to you. They will try to hinder you. They will try to slow you down. This is organized crime. It's complex. One key thing in the cases that you've heard about today is that female are perpetrators. My mother was the key perpetrator in my life. Durant talks about how one of the main factors in Shafilia's life was that they wanted to control her. You know, these are abuses, these are acts, these are patterns of assault, threats designed to humiliate, intimidate, designed to harm, punish, and frighten the victim. I've just quoted to you the legislation that is coercive and controlling behaviour. You know, when I read that legislation, I thought that's an honour-based system. That's it right there. That's the conditioning. That was my life. So there's a piece of legislation that you could consider. You know, we have forced marriage is a criminal offence, but where are the prosecutions? You know, there was one in Birmingham 2 years ago, parallel case happening in Leeds. And you look at both of the cases, they're almost identical. Teenagers, again, being taken out of education, forced into marriage. In the Birmingham case, you had a 13-year-old girl who'd been taken abroad, coerced by her mother, forced to marry a cousin older than her, repeatedly raped, etc. Brought back, aborted the child she was carrying. Her mother made it appear that, oh, she'd just been sleeping around. The point I'm making is, the family will tell you the story you want to hear. The family are the Oscar-winning performers in all these cases. The person you need to be speaking to is the victim. In every case, it is the victim. I have nothing but immense courage for survivors who come forward and they share their stories. Paisey, you know, I know that every time you retell the story, something is taken from you as well. I know that because I speak about Rubina. I see the real pain that we carry, but we also do this for a purpose, quite selflessly, actually. And what I would ask you today is to really think about what you can take from this day of memory and take back into your organization. I know Natasha talked about the percentages of people who are willing to take the spotlight, you know, download the digital assets, amplify the voices, retweet. I heard about the percentages and I sat here thinking, what about all the rest of you? Where are the other percentages? So we want more of you to do it. In 1993, I had a vision for a charity that is Karma Nirvana. And the vision came from the injustice of my sister tragically committing suicide by setting herself on fire. And a family that believed it was better for her to honor the family by killing herself than to dishonor a family by leaving an abusive husband. That did not sit with me. I carried years and years and years of being made to feel that I was the perpetrator, that when I left home, somehow I had done this to my family. So the point here is that it took me a long time to own the fact that I was actually the victim, not the perpetrator. It took me, the loss of my sister, to own that. I absolutely implore you all as practitioners to listen to victims and remind them that they are doing nothing wrong, that it is not part of your culture, tradition, or religion to be abused. Cultural acceptance does not mean accepting the unacceptable. And I'm going to leave it there because I'm being asked to wrap up too, and I do apologise if I've gone over. I thank you all for being here today. I've sat here emotionally moved and with immense pride that the vision that I had in 1993 is unfolding before my eyes in the terms of the number of people who are now breaking the silences. And I would like you to continue that. Thank you for listening.